Professor Stephen Hicks, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Hey, thanks, John, for the invite.
Well, I have been watching your online lectures, as I said before we started, for gosh, probably 15 years. I know for a fact that they were inputs into this time when I was starting to grapple with big philosophical ideas on my bus rides into New York City. And so I'm excited to have you on because I feel like we are at a moment in our public discourse, if you will, where like there is a lot of philosophical battles going on right below the surface. And I feel like you've spoken to them in your work in really powerful ways. So you are the executive director at the Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship. You're a senior scholar at the Atlas Society. You are a philosopher. You have spoken of the history of philosophy, and that, in part, is what I want to talk about today. Let's start off with sort of the simplest possible question that's not simple at all. What is the truth, and can it be known?
Take the second question first, and say my answer is yes. I'm an optimist about truth. I think sometimes truth is simple. You and I are talking to each other. Right? For me, there are books on my desk. Right? The temperature is comfortable for me. So there are lots of simple truths, but reality is complicated. And when we start to think about reality as we can with our big brain, more abstractly, more generally, we start to think about the past and things that don't exist anymore. We start to project right about the future. We want to take our very big abstract theories and use them to predict things about reality, right? All of that then gets very complicated. And we know that when we use our minds, we have to focus, we have to pay attention. Sometimes we need to self-consciously apply standards of logic and mathematics, but we get tired, we get lazy, we have biases, we have emotions, things that we want to be true, and so on. So our use of our brains is fallible. And so that's partly why when we do philosophy, part of philosophy is figuring out self-reflectively how we are using our minds when we're dealing with complicated things. And then, of course, it's more complicated because where did those standards come from? How do we know when we're doing very abstract, complicated things that, in fact, our minds are still tracking facts and that we can call the results truth? And so then we're into philosophy seriously, and there everything is very complicated. Because then it's not only I'm trying to figure out my view of truth, which basically means keeping my mind mapped onto reality. I'm aware that there are lots of other smart people out there with different frameworks. And so it's partly how does my framework map onto reality, but how does it similar and different from the other frameworks that are out there? So we're having all of these sideways discussions. So the first part is, yeah, in some sense, truth is easy. We're all aware of it, and we know lots and lots of truths. But our beliefs about lots of things that are more complicated, it gets messier, and our theories about what's going on also gets messier. Now, the simplest way I would define truth, though, is to say we start by saying there's reality out there. But then I have a capacity for awareness of reality. So there's the objects that are out there, but I'm a subject. So we have a distinction between object and subject. And there's then a relationship that hopefully develops. So reality gives me information. And then sometimes I don't have to do very much work with that information. I'm just looking at the world. But sometimes I engage in processes on that information. So I come up with beliefs, I come up with theories, I come up with ideas. And what we want to then is have a terminology that says what's going on in the subject's mind or their consciousness or their awareness. What is its relationship to objective reality? So, so there are objects out there, so to speak, simply, and then there's the subject trying to know reality. And then we develop language about both sides of that relationship. So if I say, for example, I am looking at John Papola through my video screen. So I can say that is a fact. It is a fact that John Papola is there, and I am looking at him. But what I'm focusing there is on the object side of the relationship. But then if I want to say something like my statement, I am looking at John Papola, is true, then what we're using is language to talk about what's going on inside the subject. In that case, it's a success concept. I have succeeded in using my mind in a way to state something that captures a fact. So fact language is about the object side of the relationship. Truth language is success concepts about what's going on in the subject side of the equation. And that's an introduction to some complicated territory, obviously.
All right, I'll keep this quick. If you like what you're hearing and want to hear more, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our new content as it comes out every week. And now, back to the conversation. There's so many elements of, the world we all inhabit, especially when we get on the internet and start trying to understand what's going on beyond our eyes and ears and nose and mouth, beyond our direct sensory perception, that this is such an important baseline to find either agreement or understand disagreement about. And one of the areas that I think I've been spending a fair amount of time in recently, but I think we all have for a long time, but especially in the past 5 years, is this notion of what is and isn't mis and disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have gone through this time frame where a bunch of very, let's say, complex questions were treated like they had simple answers, about public health, about race relations, about gender identity. These were about climate and climate change. These are like 4 categories of ultra complex, in a certain sense, some more than others, but ultra complex problems, if you will.
Yeah, sure.
Where the question of is your belief or is your statement true or not is not like a slam dunk easy thing like this table is made of wood or I am currently holding Stephen's book. What is the role in human capitalist production on climate change, and is it or is it not a crisis? There's a bunch of opinions one can have about that. There's a bunch of facts one can marshal on either side. And determining whether one side of that is or isn't true, and whether one side of that is or is not misinformation, that's pretty hard. And or whether or not I should take any particular medical intervention on the basis of its risk profile is something that's more complicated, but it's very personal. Yeah. And having questions about that or raising, for example, actual adverse side effects that are real, that's an observation of something that's true, but then it gets treated like it's causing a greater harm. That's also true. Vaccine hesitancy, let's say. And so we have all been subjected to a mantra that there are received truths about these very complex subjects that we have to accept as a question, as a matter of just because the authorities say so. And in the rest of the world, in Europe right now, especially, they are trying to get the government to say, we are the final arbiter of what the answer to these questions are. And if you're not on board with us, the British cops are going to show up at your front door, right? If you talk about these things and use misinformation, which might just be you have the, if you're in 2021 retweeting the Great Barrington Declaration, you could go to jail today if whatever today's version of that happens to be. How do you, and that was sort of a diatribe that's barely a question, but it was more of like a context for why the question of what truth is matters. How do you think about, this information landscape we're in right now? If I get on the internet, I see all this discourse. I have people in expert authorities saying, I know what truth is, but they seem like they're liars. How do you navigate that? How do you use
Yeah,
your tools? What's your advice for understanding what
yeah,
truth is in that kind of landscape?
right. Uh, well, so now we're adding all of the social components of cognition. I think cognition, first and foremost, is an individual function. Right? I have my eyes, my ears, my touch. I form the concepts. I put the concepts together into sentences and propositions and theories. I do the math. I do the logic, and I make a judgment call about how well I've done all of that. And I believe in various other things. At the same time, as you're rightly pointing out, we do a lot of that, and we try to bootstrap the process and accelerate the process by getting information indirectly through other people. And we then, as part of our cognitive learning process, come to learn that all of the ways in which I can use my mind well, but I can misuse my mind or just make simple mistakes, other people too can go through all of that.
Mhm.
So when I hear words coming out of someone's mouth, right, or words on a page that come from someone else, one of the things I do need to learn is this person may have done the cognitive processing well or not. And so I need to know something about that person. And so we make reliability judgments about the people from whom we are getting information. Now, the language that you introduced right at the beginning of your question, so there's information, misinformation, disinformation,
Oh,
and
and
I think
don't
that's
forget malinformation, of course, which is true
well,
information
okay,
that's
yeah,
harmful. But anyway.
yeah. And I think those distinctions are fine. We say, whatever the person says, that's information, and then I can make a judgment about the quality of that information. If I think the person is reliable, then I will say this probably is true. Right? This information that has been given to me. If I know something about the person's character, that he or she is just a sloppy thinker, or someone who just parrots and repeats whatever seems to be out there, then my probability judgment about what that person is providing will go down. And I say there's a good chance that this is misinformation. But we also know that people, in addition to simply passing on things or sloppily thinking, will deliberately lie.
Mhm.
And so in that case, I think there's a difference between saying someone is just passing on something that is not true uncritically versus passing on something that they know is untrue. So we need a different word to capture that kind of difference. So there, I think the concept of disinformation is useful. And my understanding of the history of this concept is that it does come out of the espionage world, where competing powers and superpowers would actively try to subvert the other side's understanding of what reality was. So it wasn't just that they
Yeah.
were passing on misinformation; they were constructing artificial, false, imaginary worlds and trying to get people to believe those things. So
It was
all
Stalin,
of
isn't
that,
it?
I
Isn't
think,
it
then needs to
Stalin, right?
be.
Is
Sorry.
is it under Stalin that the term disinformation first emerges?
Yeah,
It
that's my amateur understanding of the etymology, that it comes out of that kind of context, but is mapping onto a set of constants in human beings. Right, we do pass on information, we do pass on misinformation, and we do actively try to disinform other people. So all of these
yeah.
things, I'm aware of myself from my first person perspective, that sometimes I do this. I uncritically pass things on when I was a kid just because I heard it from somebody or other. Or I was lying to my sister about something or other, and that would be disinformation. But then there's a lot of perfectly good information sharing. Now, the second part of your question then is a more sophisticated evolution of that. So we're not just children sorting out how reliable are people in my cognitive landscape, sorting my peers, my fellow classmates into reliable people and not very reliable people. But then that shocking thing when we come to learn that our parents and our teachers sometimes make mistakes
Mm.
because they have been presented to us in a certain authoritative context. And so I get more sophisticated about processing things that I hear from my parents, from my teachers. So there's then the broader social landscape, and then there are all kinds of institutions that are out there, including schools, newspapers, and so forth, that are supposed to be in the information processing business
The
and part of our
sense-making institutions.
sure. Well, yeah. That's the interpretive side of things. And so they are a valuable, or at least a potentially valuable part of the cognitive division of labor. They have access to information sources that I don't. They probably have smart people on staff who can sort out important information from unimportant information, good theories from bad theories, hypotheses, and so on. And also in cases where, as you also said in your comment, there are genuinely complex competing interpretations, and nobody yet knows the truth. Part of the cognitive division of labor of schools and universities and newspapers and opinion magazines is to present to us what those controversies are so that we can, in an informed way, hopefully enter into the conversation. So all of that then needs to get sorted out. There's individual cognitive psychology, but then we do a lot of this in a social context. So all of the social psychology becomes important. And then I think a part of that is once we've sorted out that terrain, we want to institutionalize certain things. We want to set up these specialized institutions, medical schools in the case of COVID, right? Or research institutions at universities and independently that will investigate climate change, various things. And then I think of the political forum, even government as an official institution we set up for information sharing and debate, and then decisions about what theories we're going to believe, so to speak, collectively in our political environment for the next 4 years until we have the next election and so on. And so if we then take information, misinformation, disinformation as our first kind of taxonomy of that terrain, we know all of those institutions are subject to all of those. And so hopefully we have within those institutions checks to make sure that the output is higher quality, not too much misinformation gets out, not too much disinformation gets out. But then at the same time, we do know, and this I think is coming to your very first question, we're in a philosophical landscape where a lot of that information processing theory, cognitive theory, individual and social, and the institutions have been corrupted by certain philosophies that some of them are just misinformation, but some of them are actively trying to subvert those institutions so as to engage in various kinds of disinformation processes. And then the complication is, if we just confine ourselves to even America, we've got 340 million or so people, and some of them are young, some of them are teenagers, some of them are older, and they are, going through the life process, a big, sprawling, open society, and it, in some cases, cognitively healthy, but also in many cases is a big cognitive mess, and that's frustrating.
Yeah, I think that there's never been a time in human history where the individual has more access to more information than today, right? And that's
That's
only
absolutely right.
growing. And so you have this literal sensory overload, the sense in which, wow, I can choose to fill my entire day with Stephen Hicks lectures for the past
Yeah.
decade, which would be a
Well,
far
that's a
better
good use of one's time,
yeah,
of
it'd be a far
course.
better
Yes.
choice than most things you could do. Or any number of other things, an infinite amount of things, and an infinite amount of tellings of tales about things that are important. And I think it's never been harder to know what to trust. It's never been harder to have a good gut for what is and is not a reliable source. And I'm not saying like the old world, the Walter Cronkite era of 3 broadcast networks. I don't think that was a more truthful world. If anything, it was maybe even a less truthful world because a single lie would have a third to half to almost total market
Yeah.
share.
Yeah.
Whether it's the Gulf of Tonkin as a pretext for war in Vietnam, or any number of public lies that were told to everyone all at the same time and received. Like, for example, JFK going before the press corps in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion and saying the United States government had nothing to do with this, which was a
Mm.
lie. It was
Yeah.
active disinformation, maybe for a good reason, maybe not, but it was a lie. Today we watch these international things happen in real time. We watch the disastrous pullout of Afghanistan, or the seemingly far-flung distant torture chambers of Abu Ghraib in Iraq, or any number of things. Or the fact that the CDC knew that 6 feet was nonsense and that 12 feet was just not going to be politically functional, so they said 6 feet, which was just a big lie. Where do you start now? What's your advice for where to start? I want to get into the depths of sort of the philosophical underpinnings that you spend so much time talking about postmodernism and the idea that there is no truth and how this has infected our institutions. But just practically, do you have a way to sort of exercise like cognitive hygiene? Like, how do you navigate this world of information that we live in?
All right. Again, that's a great network of observations and a capstone question. Let me try an analogy, because you started off talking about our cultural moment, and in some way we're facing new challenges, the sensory overload, information overload kind of issue. So the analogy I want to make is to say the physical side of our being, because in the last 2 centuries, say, we also are at a cultural moment that human beings never had to face before, and that is living in an era of plenty, where we have more food than we can possibly consume, and more kinds of food that we can possibly consume. And just as you say, you could go on your devices and decide, I'm just going to absorb certain kinds of information from certain sources unendingly, and that's a new thing for humans to have to deal with. The same thing is modern human beings now can go into their refrigerators, and they open the refrigerator door and it's just jammed full, and their pantries are full, and they know that they can go to a grocery store and there's a dozen of them nearby just full of stuff. And so they could just like eat stuff and in an uncritical way and then become unhealthily obese. So the same thing, I think that is a challenge for us in the modern world. How do we handle that? Also is true of us in the modern world on the cognition and information and devices available to us. So part of then what we need to do is learn. Yes, we do have appetites. I usually sometimes just want to eat and eat. And sometimes I want to eat in an undiscriminatory way, just eat anything that appeals to my taste buds. So part of what we do need to learn in the modern world is what people never had to worry about before was, how much should I eat? What should my caloric intake be on a given day? How do I control my appetites, control my desires, allocate my budget, allocate my eating time, and then even more complicatedly, learn about the difference between good foods and junk foods and things that have zero nutritional value. Whereas before it was not an issue, whatever I could eat, I would just eat it in an uncritical way. So we are going up the learning curve on all of those issues. And as we know, much of the 20th century with rising obesity rates and all kinds of health issues, some of us learned quickly, some of us did not learn very quickly. And so it's a cross-generational learning process. I think
That's a really great analogy, and also a somewhat dark one, because we are nowhere near a sort of broadly shared and exercised like proper sense of what healthy eating is in the 21st
Right.
century.
Yeah. So that's even the next level.
It's
That's
like we're
right. So
not
even
there.
if
Like, we're still not there.
that's right. Even if I say, okay, I'm going to work out, I'm going to eat a certain number of meals a day, I'm going to stay within a certain number of calories and try to balance proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and all of that. Yeah, I don't have time to get 3 PhDs in nutrition and biochemistry, so I am going to rely on other people But then, of course, human biochemistry is extraordinarily complicated. So all of that is very complicated as well.
We
And
love
so then
dense
that
calorie
leads us
foods.
directly into the second issue,
Yeah.
on the purely information side. So it's not just about my nutritional habits. It's what do I think about religion? Right? And we might then say 1,000 years ago, most people were in monocultures. There was one religion in their social environment, and they might be vaguely aware that, on the other side of the world, people believe these weird things or whatever they are, but they don't have time to think about them and they don't have any reliable sources. So then as we get into the modern world, suddenly we're aware of all sorts of religious opportunities. And in the modern world, we put responsibility more on the individual to think through his or her religious views and make their own decisions. And we do that for economics. 1,000 years ago, you were born into a certain strata in society. All of the decisions about what your work was going to be were by and large made because you were born into this class, and that's going to be your job. And boys do boy things, and girls do girl things. Now, in the modern world, we take all of the economic decisions. What is my career going to be? And there's a billion of them that are out there. And if you don't like any of those, make your own, become an entrepreneur. And so all of that puts increasing cognitive and broader psychological loads on human beings. And we do it with people's romantic lives. Instead of mom and dad arrange your marriage for you, right? Or you, again, marriage within this very small social circle. Now it's, play the field, think very romantically, and all of that responsibility and a huge amount of information that has to
do
be.
all the swiping, do the swiping apps.
Well, okay, that's this generation. I missed that whole phenomenon.
I missed it too. Thank the Lord in heaven.
But right, I'm aware of it, right? So it's not just nutrition and religion and my work life and my romantic life and my political life, right? And then, as you said, in the previous question, we want people to think about COVID and climate change and all sorts in foreign policy and all sorts of things. So
take a stance on Gaza, take a stance on Ukraine, take a stance on any number of things that you have no control over.
Pronouns and transgender
all the things.
And partly that's because we have this ongoing dynamic global society, and so we're discovering all kinds of new things and pushing frontiers in lots of ways. But at the same time, we have been committed in the modern world to having an open society, a democratic/republican society, where we have devolved all of these responsibilities to the individual, and we want the individuals to make the decisions for their own lives in all of these areas, and we want those individuals to come together in certain kinds of social institutions and decide cooperatively what the policies are going to be in those various domains as well. So that is a huge, huge amount of responsibility and work that we're asking people to do in the modern world that is historically unprecedented. So we are exactly in that moment. Now, to come back to your early question, in my profession, this is where I think philosophy then becomes increasingly important as a discipline, because philosophy is asking what's the nature of reality, broadly speaking? How do we sort out things that are real from things that are fantastical, or things that are real from things that are imaginary? What are the important values in one's life? How much control over one's destiny does one have? How can one learn not only to use this very complicated package of biology, one's body, in an adult way to be able to do all sorts of physical things, but even more importantly, this extraordinarily complicated thing we call the human mind, which is why we spend 18 years educating kids until we think they are adults. Well, okay, we can come back to that. Right, but just if we look at it, kind of psychobiologically, human beings, the amount of time we spend educating kids until we think they are cognitively ready, psychologically ready to take on the world, it is way more than a decade. You compare that with other relatively intelligent animal species like dogs or cats. They're pretty smart in some ways, but basically for a kitten or dog, it's 6 or 8 months and then it knows everything it needs to know to function as an adult cat or as an adult dog, and then it's off in the world. And it might be, with some of the primates, chimpanzees and so on, it's a matter of a few years. But by the time they're 4 or 5, they're adults. They're ready. We look at our 4 or 5-year-olds; they're still
helpless, utterly helpless.
That's right. So we then,
unless you're in Japan, then you can send your 3-year-old out onto the subway alone.
Well, yes, there you go. That's right. Yeah. So there's just all of the cognitive stuff, all of the emotional stuff, all of the mind-body integration stuff, all of the value sorting out that has to go on, and it's at least in the modern world, it's an 18-year or more process. Give or take a few years, depending on the kid.
And
so
that
all
itself,
of
that seems modern, truly modern, in that our rites of passage, all religiously, seem to linger around the middle school age, around 11, 12, 13.
Yes.
And so it seems like, looking at the longer reach of history, we used to consider adulthood to basically be when you've come of age roughly around 13 years old.
That's right. Well, so biologically you come online, and so psychologically you need to be prepared. And also due to political and economic circumstance, you had to start working. Right? There was no what we now think of, the teen years. I'm going to find myself and explore.
Adolescence. This is like a modern concept.
Right. It's a total redefinition of what adolescence involves. So all of that, I think, underscores the importance of philosophy undergirding what we are doing with young people for then 18 or now 20 or 22 years before we think they are ready for adult life. And a huge amount of that has to be psychological, cognitive, emotional preparedness, and so on. And so if there are disasters happening in the world of philosophy, that is going to spill out into all of the other cultural spheres. And even just in my living memory, I could, my last, so I like to make this joke, my last name is Hicks. And so that means farming background. And that's true, right? All of the Hickses were like farmers as far back as you can go. Our family joke is we've been farmers for so long, we're the ones who invented dirt in the first place for farming. So we think that's hilarious. But anyway, so
you're literally a bunch of Hicks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. It meant city folk looking down on people who are out in the country who are farmers. But so my grandfather's generation, they were all on the farm, and you got an 8th grade education. That was by Canadian standards in the early mid part of the 20th century. That's the norm. That's to be expected. High school, right, really meant something higher and elevated. And who needs to go to high school? Right? But then my parents' generation was, the expectation is now you will get through high school. You will get your 12th grade degree, or in Ontario, where I grew up, there was a grade 13, which is a little bit more college prep, but you will get through high school, every kid. And college, higher education. Oh no, well, maybe, some few people go off to higher education.
I went back to look because there's this story that we are told, especially by teachers' unions in the United States, that that K through 12 education, as it is currently pushed on us, built the middle class. And so an interesting counter note to that is that when I looked back at what was the education level in the 1950s in the US, and it was only a minority of Americans in the 1950s had more than a high school, had graduated high school. It was something like a third of adults in 1950 were high school graduates. So this sort of pinnacle of middle class economic growth and prosperity that everyone looks to for different reasons through their own political lens, as being like the time of maximum American nostalgia, 1950s and 60s. Most people didn't even have a high school diploma. So it's like, well, okay.
Yeah. No,
So,
yeah,
yeah,
they didn't have it, but it had become aspirational at that point, right? I
yeah.
mean, typically these things do start as aspirations, and then the reality catches up, a decade or 2 years
It's
later.
easy to. It's like it shocked me. I was shocked to see how few Americans actually had a high school diploma in the
Yeah, yeah,
halcyon time of the post-war boom,
yeah,
and it
yeah.
just speaks to sort of how much we've been, to some extent, perhaps propagandized. But
Mm,
so you were saying you've got this sort of history of a agrarian life, comparatively low expectations about what constitutes being educated. How does that start to change things and keep going
yeah.
with that?
Well, it does start to change partly for romantic aspirational reasons, going back to early modernity and the Enlightenment. If we see over the course of the Enlightenment, 1600s to the 1700s, this idea that you can take charge of your life in
Yeah.
all of these areas, and you should take charge of your life. And that means that you should not simply just accept whatever previously defined social roles have been mapped out for you. So at this moment, it starts with religion and art. We start to see people then saying, I can be my own artist, and I can be a writer, I can be a painter, I can be a sculptor. I can, if I love theater, go into theater. And so we see a change in aspirations that instead of all of those possible career paths being, no, those are not socially acceptable, young people typically fighting for not their political right necessarily, but their social right and their right within the family to go and do what they wanted in their careers. We start to see this in the 1700s being extended toward women. That women are human beings; they have their own life. The pursuit of happiness should devolve for them, so they too should get an education, and we should start getting rid of social and economic and political barriers to women, so that they can explore all of these things. A lot of it has to do with technology and the celebrated stories about the Industrial Revolution. So suddenly, we're producing all of this stuff, which means that people can have more stuff. Stuff is cheaper. In many cases, it's better made. And we are opening up all kinds of new careers for people that are more technical, a little more scientific, sometimes more entrepreneurial, bigger organizations, which means we need managerial skills and leadership skills and so on. And all of this is not just a few people, these are all dispersed things in a lot of different social sectors.
Yeah, and I
So
think
it
about
makes sense
that
then.
transition off the farm in particular, the sense in which
Yeah,
suddenly a tractor can do the work of not just your kids, but like an army of your kids and
yeah,
leave you
that's
with a
right.
surplus. And so now your
Yeah,
kids don't need to work on the farm,
yeah,
and now your kids want to go into the city. And now
right,
they don't want to come back to the farm.
right.
And fast forward to today when 2% of the US population works in agriculture.
Yeah, exactly. That's a perfectly good example. And it's not only that then we then need to have a whole bunch of people who know how to make tractors
Mhm.
and maintain tractors and improve tractors. And so that is going to force a certain kind of education, that we're going to have kids who are more creative and inventive and start to prize those traits among people. We recognize the importance of science and mathematics. So we were going to push more scientific literacy, mathematics literacy, and education then is going to be transformed in that way. We need larger institutions, in schooling institutions, and so resources are directed in that way as well. So all of these social movements and technological movements then are going to force changes in the education landscape, of course. And so that is, in one sense, a long story, but it starts 200 or 300 years ago. What we now call liberal arts education is a product of this era. Now, there are antecedents of that going back to the High Middle Ages, but the idea that education should mean that you know a little bit about a lot of things, theory things, and how those things are applied in reality so you can take charge of your life and live as a free human being. All of that is being conceptualized as the medieval world is starting to break up and we are getting into the modern world. So there are lots of experiments that are trying to keep pace in part with the other social trends that are already going on in the modern world. Now, another part of this is going to be religion. So we can say, go back to the early modern world and just do a potted history here. So the Catholicism, by and large, has a monopoly on Europe, religiously speaking. There are reformist attempts that are going on here and there. There are minorities of Jews and minorities of various other people kicking around, but by and large, it's a Catholic understanding that's a monopoly. And then one of the big debates with the early reformers has to do with a tricky theological issue. If religion is about saving your soul, well, how does one's soul get saved? And the traditional answer was that you go through the church, or you go to the institution, you listen to the priest advises you, tells you what you need to do, but the priest gets it from the institutional authorities, and it's a very hierarchical institution all the way up to the Pope, and the Pope is the only one who occasionally speaks to God. So there we have an entire cognitive philosophy, right? Truth comes from God and it's communicated to the Pope and some, of course, of the old prophets, but then it filters down through this institutionalized hierarchy to 90+% of the population who don't have direct access to God. And because they are illiterate, largely, they don't have even direct access to Scripture, which is mostly in Latin at that time, translated from original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. So part of the revolution, though, is then this issue about saving my soul. And if we have a philosophical change there, where we say it's not a matter of you going socially through this hierarchical institution, the salvation of your soul is up to you as an individual. And it is possible for you to have a direct relationship with God. That's what we call a metaphysical connection. My soul connected to God's spirituality, to cut out all of the middlemen. Now, if we make that philosophical move, which is very individualistic, then the follow-up question is, well, how do I establish this direct connection with God? And then the early reformers' answer is to say, well, you have to read God's word, and that is Scripture. And what that means then is that Scripture has to be translated for the vast majority of people out of Latin, Greek, Aramaic, and so on, into the vernacular, the language of the vast majority of people. So the early reformers are making this then big move. So it's a metaphysical claim, direct soul connection between you and God, that's forcing a cognitive change, an epistemological change. Individuals can think about religious matters for themselves if they have access to the original source, so to speak. So they go and do all of the translations, and there's all the resistance and people getting burned at the stake and killed for translating the Bible into whatever languages and so on. But what comes out of all,
you have the the technological revolution of the printing press, which
Gutenberg in the 1400s, right? So then the cost of information dispersal goes way down. There's a lot more stuff that is available. So that's a technological revolution that is working with these philosophical revolutions. So then what you have is a great education campaign. Right? It's not enough to translate things into German or Italian or English or French or whatever. So everybody can read this thing for themselves. You have this education committee. Everybody needs to learn how to read, basically, so that they can read Scripture. And that means we have huge social resources that are devoted by parents and others to schooling, in basic schooling. And that's already a great, huge revolutionary transformation.
I want to linger at this moment with you for a sec,
fine.
since you've taken us down this religious history road for a sec, which is I very much would say that I'm a classical liberal thinker fundamentally, individualist methodologically, like I think about that people make choices and that groups don't really choose in the same way that we use the word choice for the individual.
Yes.
Things happen in groups. There's an emergent thing. Like if we all get together, a decision will be made about where we're going to go to dinner, but it is not the same exact type of thing as me deciding for myself. It is some other negotiation.
Yeah. Well, we can break that down, but yes.
So I have been I'm Catholic, a practicing Catholic. I'm a practicing Catholic, anarcho-curious libertarian, you could say, which is quite an interesting combo. And well, maybe it's interesting. I think it's interesting. Tom Holland has a book called Dominion. I don't know if you've encountered this work.
I've heard his name, but I've not read the book.
He makes an argument about the impact of Christendom, of the church, and then of the broader Christian culture that ends up being, increasingly Protestant and whatnot. That I think is interesting. It's had an impact on me, and I'm curious how you think about this, which is that the sort of claim to universal sort of human equality or human dignity, or the kind of individualism that we see in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. His argument, I think I can represent accurately, is that for all of the church's hierarchical faults, its attacks on heresy, its sort of toxic merger with state power at that time, it in some ways has not been given quite enough credit for planting this philosophical, moral, and metaphysical seed of universal human equality into this creature, the human, that is not physically equal and that has never seen itself as being universally equal. That the universal, Catholic means universal, that universal moral claim is an essential part of the evolution of what today we would just call like modern ethics, like modern individualistic ethics.
Yeah.
Do you accept that? I know there's lots of ways it can be pushed back on. I'm curious if you think that that's a sound reading of, if not the theology, at least like the history of the West and of the Enlightenment.
I'm not impressed with that kind of argument, right? At all. Right?
Okay.
I think what has happened is that many contemporary religious people who are genuinely religious people and rational and modernized are doing some wishful thinking, both about the history and the theology. At the same time, I don't want to say entirely to dismiss that, right? And in some cases, it comes down to kind of judgment calls about percentages of credit that go to various historical individuals and institutions. So I think it is fair to say that if you just take the Abrahamic religions, and there you've got the big three: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that there are some more individualistic elements in the Christian tradition than you find in the other two. But they are kind of interesting historically and worth teasing out, but they amount to a very tiny part of the explanation of where individualism came from intellectually and historically, right, so to speak. So that then means we would have to get into both the theology and some of the history. So I think if we go back, say, just to the history, I am outside of those traditions. Mm-hmm. So all I can do is say, well, I will read the Bible and see whether there are any hints of individualism in there or robust individualistic themes in there, or not. And so that's just to do the theology, and we can have some debates about that. But then also, I think since I am not inside those traditions, the best I can do is to say, if we want to know, say, what Christianity means, I will respect the traditions and look at what their most prominent exponents have said about the issue. So on the Catholic side, I would say the two most important names, and all good Catholics, I think, will say this, are St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And I'm no perfect expert on this, but yeah.
No, but if you then take however many hundreds or thousands of super smart people in the Catholic tradition they have been, they're all saying, and there's the divide still between them about whether the more Augustinian or Thomist version of Catholicism is the best one. And then if you look at both of them, right, and then you ask this question, here are the most authorized, they are saints for a reason, for their intellectual prominence within those traditions. What do they say about individualism from their Catholic Christian interpretations? And it's not going to be very happy reading for this modern interpretation that wants to say it's individualistic. Both of them had no problem with burning heretics and so forth. Just to take one issue. On the other side, if you want to look at the Protestants, again, from outside those traditions, would say, well, who are the most prominent names here? And there you have to say Martin Luther and John Calvin. And then we would ask the same question. So if those are the big gun representatives of the Protestant Christian tradition, then we would ask the same question. Where do we, or about individualism, and do we find them highlighting, emphasizing, arguing for, and historically influencing what we now call the modern individualistic tradition? And again, that's not happy reading for that modern interpretation that you floated a little while ago. Again, both of them are quite comfortable with hierarchical structures, with with burning and killing and doing various sorts of nasty people and elevating themselves to certain hierarchical positions within the church. So from my view, this goes back to what we were talking about maybe 5 minutes ago. I think there is individualism, but it comes out more as an unintended consequence of some of the internal dynamics in religious history. So if you say, for example, I want everybody to save their soul, everybody equally, well, that's a proto-individualistic theme. It's not that only certain elect people are going to have their souls saved. Everybody potentially can save their souls. But then, of course, we go down that route, and we're getting rid of all the Calvinists, right? Because they are right. Yeah. And there are lots of major Catholic traditions who are saying, no, hell is going to be a very busy place, right? There's just a lot of people who are not, they don't have the possibility even of having their souls saved.
For what it's worth, as I understand it, the current Catholic view is that the church does not claim to know if anyone is in heaven, in hell. That there's no sort of official say, like, we know who's in hell. It's like, no, we don't know.
Right. Yeah. So, and that's a kind of agnostic or skeptical claim on that particular issue. But yeah, and if that's the current view, then that's fine. But that, of course, is not the only view, prominent view in the tradition. So I do think there is a seed of saying, individuals should read Bible for themselves, and that's a cognitive individualism. You are responsible for your own soul. Narrowly focused on that issue. But the unintended consequence is that once people start reading the Bible for themselves, then they start to get together and talk about their interpretations, and they disagree with each other, and they have lots of arguments, but they get smarter as a result of engaging in that debate process. And because they have read this book, they are now literate. They are starting, because human beings are curious creatures interested in starting to read other things, and other things are available to them. So what happens then is the goal was not for us to develop a modern individualism where people are reading all sorts of things, so anything they can get their hands on, and arguing about everything with all of the social and political consequences of that. But you can trace that as a consequence of teaching people, lots and lots of people to read, and that is coming out of a Christian tradition. So I think a better explanation is to say, and this is to leave aside even some of the theological issues about what it means to say we're all equal when we go back to the original text, or made in the image of God, and et
or
cetera, et
neither, or
cetera.
like St. Paul, like neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. There's a kind of equality in faith that I think you can find.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I'm not
That's right.
a perfect apologist, let's say, but
No, but you're a
yeah.
smart guy, you're an educated guy, and that our hope in the modern world is that all of us can become smart and educated and figure out these issues for ourselves. And that is to raise another issue. It's not just to say the individualism, but there's this issue of kind of a freedom of conscience issue. And as you pointed out, we are equal in some way. So all of those issues are there. And so it partly becomes then a matter of how much weight did they have historically in creating the modern world.
Yeah, I mean, I think
So
too, to some extent, like there's a fundamental, if you believe that you have free will to decide how you're going to act, and that whether or not your choices are moral depend upon them being choices, that sort of bakes into the cake a kind of moral agency
yes, absolutely.
that's like there. It's like, well, if I act because I'm being coerced, that's not that's got a different character to it morally than if I decide for myself how I'm going to act. If I steal from a
Yeah,
grocery store, or if I kill a person, uh, you know, because I
yeah.
wanted to, it's a very different
Right.
thing than if somebody's got a gun into my back forcing me to do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. So yeah, moral agency, freedom of conscience, equality, some kind of individualism, all of those elements, right? We can look for those. Then I would just say then two things. One is the historical thing. Can we show as historians that it was those claims made by Christian thinkers who interpreted them a certain way that were the historically influential things in shaping the modern world? And that's an interesting historical question. Uh, um, and then the other thing is the theological claim. What do we actually mean when we take these seeds, shall we say, how we interpret them in the best Christian tradition? And there I just am going to fall back on saying, well, how did Augustine interpret it? How did Aquinas, how did Luther, how did Calvin do it? And those are the big four that I typically focus on. And all four of them seem to have no problem with saying on this freedom of consciousness and moral agency that we're perfectly fine with overriding that if we think you are a heretic and torturing you in various ways. So if those are the biggest and brightest brains in the tradition, and both of them are saying whatever we mean by individual moral agency, it doesn't include the huge number of heretics out there, well, then I think that's a judgment, not only historical, but about what's the theological, or the best theological interpretation within Christianity. But all of that is underscoring, I think, again, the importance of philosophy. And then in this case, it would be philosophically informed history. So I think the best way to look at this set of issues, to go back to the book that you mentioned, is I think the commonplace interpretation of Western civilization is to say that the two important traditions, moral traditions, if we just focus on those for a moment, are certainly Judeo-Christian tradition. Islam less important in the West, but increasingly important as the modern world goes on. But that whole Judeo-Christian tradition on the one side, but then the Greco-Roman tradition on the other.
Which includes the
Uh,
Stoics
the
among them.
Stoics, Aristotle, Plato, the hedonists, and so on. And so by the time we get to high Middle Ages, on into Renaissance, early modernity, what we have is two giant traditions, both of them having very robust moral theories and sets of moral practice that are operative in the minds, or what we might call the early modern mind, that's going to lead to the Enlightenment. And I do think that the best judgment is going to be to say that both contributed positively. And so I think you find elements from both of them. But then this follow-up question is going to be the weighting question. Is it that we are 80% Greco-Roman as we get into the modern world and 20% Judeo-Christian? Is it 50-50 or some other mix? And I think that requires doing a lot of history and intellectual history to form that judgment.
I used to have these weirdly raucous debates with a stridently atheist buddy of mine who was also a coworker when I was at Spike TV. My argument, in the most grandest scale, was, well, the worst period for the church is the point at which the church and state had become one, which was not unusual because basically the history of religion.
You mean 300s?
Well, perhaps, into like continuing into the Middle Ages, right? And Luther, and even if they weren't technically the same, they were so closely connected between the king and the Pope, the Holy Roman Empire, all that stuff. I'm a cheap pop historian, so bear with me. But that you have this period where the church goes from being this like persecuted bunch of young Christians who are to then being adopted by the Romans and then institutionalized as a government or quasi-government thing. And of course, it's kind of horrible and murderous. And then the 20th century comes along, and we get this interesting test of which part of the dual personality becomes worse. So the church becomes separate, and then we have this wave of explicitly atheist states, specifically the Soviet Union, now as China, the communist world. And it's like the most murderous thing we've ever seen. And the church kind of becomes like this Mother Teresa type of enterprise, relatively, sex scandals, etc., notwithstanding. And so I think, and I know you've written about Nietzsche at length, and about this, like the sense of like, God, we've killed God, and we might not be happy with the world we've built in the aftermath. And who we replace him with. It seems like when we kill God, we replace him with pretty nasty guys with mustaches, at least in the past 100+ years.
Did Mao have a mustache?
Well,
I know you're thinking Hitler and Stalin. So we might
mustaches, or let's say colorful
weird
haircuts, weird haircuts, shirts with no
they don't even have a full collar, for goodness sake.
Collarless shirts and funky mustaches or hairdos that just sure as heck make burning heretics seem like child's play. How do you respond to that? I know you don't believe in God. You're objectivist thinker. So, but how do you grapple with that big picture
Hitler issue?
I don't know. On balance, I'd rather be in modern Christendom for all its faults than the atheistic alternatives, and even in modern context, like the fake religions. Maybe everyone if you believe they're all fake, fine. But the more recent fake religions like wokeism end up looking a lot like Stalin and Mao anyway.
Absolutely.
So how do you grapple with that? And maybe what can we learn from your study of Nietzsche and the philosophical traditions about why that maybe happened, or is it just correlation, not causation? How do you think about it?
No, I think there's causation for sure. I think on this issue, we need to integrate the two dimensions, philosophical dimensions or issues that you're putting on the table. One is the distinction between the theists and the atheists. So that's going to be one. But then also this individualist or not position. And we might call it collectivist. We haven't defined that term yet. So what that then means is, I think this would be the first thing when you're sorting out the history here, is you would start with a 2x2 table. So you would say, here are the theists, and here are the atheists. Right? And then on the vertical axis, you would have individualists and collectivists. What you will find, this is the thing, is that it is always the collectivists whether they are atheist or theist, who are responsible for the disasters, right? The great religious disasters and the great atheist political system disasters as well. By contrast, if you have religions that are more individualistic and you have atheist philosophies that are more individualistic, those ones are uniformly more peaceful, more tolerant, more live and let live. So if we then say we are worried about, say, the eras when it was church and state, right, and then part of then the official philosophy there was that the entire polity, the entire community has to be on the same page religiously speaking. And we think so that this should be enforced for religious reasons, but now we also have the political tools to do the enforcement. So it's that collectivized understanding of a religion now joined forces with politics, and that leads to disaster. The same thing what we have is in the case of Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, Communist China, and so on. So those are not religious systems. They are on the atheist side, but they have materialistic collectivist viewpoints. Everybody in our society has to be on the same page. And we are going to use the force of government, politics, to enforce everybody being on the same ideological page. So in that case, you have atheist collectivism becoming disastrous, but then you also, on the other eras, have theistic collectivism becoming disastrous. Now, by contrast, if you look at the theistic philosophies that are more individualistic, so what you have is, it's my moral responsibility to save my soul and thereby to run my life. And you have a large then number of people who start to believe in that. They start to become more educated. What you get immediately in the next century is now we're moving from early Protestant Reformation in the 1500s to 1600s. And probably the giant name to focus on here is John Locke, who was a classical liberal, kind of the archetypical classical liberal, very individualistic. It's your mind, think for yourself, gather your own evidence. I have liberty rights. I should have property rights. I should have a right to my own. And he is a religious man. He believes that Christianity is a reasonable hypothesis, that if we look at the evidence and the arguments, we can prove not only a God, but something like the Christian God. So what you there have is a religious philosophy combined with an individualism. And there what you get is the idea of religious tolerance coming out explicitly, separating church and state. And we have to respect individuals going their own way. So it's religion combined with individualism, and that leads to what we would say are desirable outcomes.
I would
And the
add
same thing.
one element.
I'm going to
Go ahead.
I
Yeah.
just want to say, because there's one
Yeah.
more quadrant that we have to look at.
Sure.
Then you find the same thing among the deists and the agnostics and the atheists, who then want to say, well, maybe there's a God, but he just has left the world to us as individuals to run for ourselves. For I know there is no God, and it's up to me to take charge of my own life. All of those are not theistic philosophies, so to speak, but all of them, because they have individualism built into them, end up being pluralistic, emphasizing diversity, emphasizing toleration, and so on. So the decisive thing is not whether one is atheist or theist. The decisive thing is one an individualist or a collectivist? All the disasters come from collectivism.
I think that is a accurate description for sure. I think that the one other thing I just was going to throw in was that in that broad sweep of sort of like people like John Locke or Montesquieu, who was also a really important thinker for the history of America and was I think a Catholic. Um, the move towards abolitionism, I believe, is overwhelmingly Christian in its orientation. I think all of the major abolitionists had, I think, a Christian tradition that was informing their abolitionism.
Okay.
which is good, which is like a good sign. It's a
Yeah.
check on the box of, you know, if you think about like why would you turn on this thing, slavery, it suggests things about a kind of orientation towards a respect for the individual that's really important and powerful.
Yeah.
Um,
All right. Well, do you want to jump into the abolition slavery history issue?
Well, if you've got a counterpoint, I'd certainly love to hear it because
Yeah. Okay.
I'm working my way
Yes.
through trying to understand this history
Yeah. Yeah.
accurately.
Yeah.
So
No, it's
this is what I've heard said, and I've
yeah.
read about it in different places, but I haven't done a deep read. So if there's more
Yeah.
to it, I'd love to hear it.
Okay. So again, I think this is a beautiful success story for human beings, the abolition movement, that you can see some seeds of it in the 1600s.
Is that the levelers or before that?
Possibly. That's on the equality side of things,
Yeah.
more than the liberty side of things, and that's another part of the story. Picking up speed in the early 1700s, and then I think decisively the 1780s are the most important movement, where it's not just some important voices here and there, but we then have a critical mass of people, and we start to see societies formed or organizations formed for the elimination of slavery. Now, that's one broad strokes move. So that we do have to ask the question why it is happening in the 1700s, why it didn't happen in the 1500s, the 1300s, the 900s, the 800s, and so on.
Yeah, it's a good question.
So at that point, Christianity has been around for well over a millennium, no action on this issue, a millennium and a half. As we started to get into the modern revolutions in philosophy and the development of the Enlightenment, suddenly action on the slavery issue and the formation of abolition societies. So that's just to raise a question about the timing.
Sure.
Now, follow-up thing then would be to say, if you look at the three anti-slavery movements that were formed, the first one in the United States, the very early United States, co-founded by Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Franklin became early president, and some early figures there. Then shortly there,
was that largely Quaker in
right? So
orientation?
that will be the next drill down thing
Okay,
when we
sure.
get
Yeah,
into that
okay.
particular movement. Yes. And then a year after in England, and then very quickly William Wilberforce joins that movement, and he becomes the leading light. And then across the channel in France, the Society of the Friends of Blacks, as it was called there, an anti-abolition society. So within 2 or 3 years of each other, in America, Britain, and France, right, we have these movements, and we don't find those movements active in other parts of Christendom, so to speak. There are lots of other Christian countries right around the world, but it's these three. And again, the historical point to focus on is that these are the most enlightened modern societies in the world. Both of them have certain attitudes with respect to Christianity and institutionalized Christianity and so on. So then you say, okay, all right, that's interesting, both about the timing and the location of the three. If you then start to look at the composition of the membership of the societies, then I think this is where it gets interesting, and the weeds discussions among professional historians becomes really important. If you start with the French, I think chronologically they were 1788, the society is formed. There are, I think, of the founding group of a dozen or so people, no religious people. Maybe one abbé who's a little bit more deistic. But it is, in that case, pretty much explicitly part of the French Enlightenment, believing in liberty and equality for all human beings. And so it's coming out of that Enlightenment tradition. In the case of Britain, I think it's a more of a mixture. But it is interestingly almost all dissenters or low church Protestants who are forming the movement, and then a couple of people who are Anglican, like Wilberforce, but they were seen within the broader tradition of Anglicanism as close to Low Church and almost somewhat heretical, right, for these views. And then a couple of people who were more deistic. And among that mix, you then have the Quakers, right, who had interestingly started in the 1600s in England, and then the Quaker story becomes important across in America. If you then go and you look at the composition of the American society, you do find a substantial number of Quakers in that early movement, and then a few other low church people, and some people who are deists, like Benjamin Franklin, who was a big part of it. So what you then have is a mixture of Enlightenment ideas, right? They're not particularly religious. In some cases, they are anti-religious and anti the institutions, or at least the dominant religious institutions, and largely kind of deists or low church, mostly Protestants.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another important thing then is to say this is still a tiny percentage of overall Christendom. And if you were to survey most of Christendom at that point, including the institutionalized forms of Christendom, the most famous theologians of the day, you find that basically all of them have no problem whatsoever with slavery. In many cases, they are continuing to endorse slavery, and they are attacking these low church people and the deists and the atheists, right, who are forming the abolition movement for violating what is something obvious to them, that the Bible is perfectly fine with slavery, it sanctions slavery, and the right interpretation, right, and so on. So we have a minority movement within Christianity that I think it's correct to say is historically important to the abolition movement. But that's not to underscore that a lot of deists and atheists were also in the movement. So you do have a mixed movement. And I think one of the interesting things is that this is the way much of modernity worked itself out. It was some people coming out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but wanting to modernize it in a certain direction, and combined with a lot of people who had revived Greek and Roman traditions, not religious traditions, who wanted to take the world. And they found various ways to overlap.
Yeah, it seems like I mean, we see this very physically in our capital, that the founders were really enamored with that Greco-Roman philosophical tradition.
It's making a political statement, absolutely.
Yeah, it's like you go and you see the columns, you see a Romanesque architecture in DC for a reason. It's a reflection of that.
And it's not just in DC, it's in almost every state capital that you go to, and every courthouse in every county courthouse in, at least in the eastern half of the country, a lot of the western ones, they're explicitly drawing their fundamental traditions, right? They're not modeled after cathedrals, they're modeled after Greek and Roman architecture. I want to just say also, just to go back to the importance of the Quakers, right? It is interesting that the type of theological approach the Quakers adopt was not original with them. You see it popping up here and there all through Christian history, but it's almost always stamped down as heretical, this radical kind of egalitarianism. Now, of course, the Quakers want to say all of those previous interpretations of what Christianity really means are wrong, and we Quakers have gotten it right. Right? But of course, the mainstream of Christianity wants to argue. Now, what is interesting, and I think this is where there's an important theological grain of truth, that what the Quakers are emphasizing is not the liberty of human beings, because they're very much in the idea of everybody submitting to higher authority, as long as that higher authority is God, and seeing oneself as largely helpless in the face of sin. So they don't have a strong sense of moral agency, right? Which is why if you look in at yourself, you realize what an evil person you are, but you realize that God is walking you, you should be quaking in your boots, right? Because it's the fear of God that is going on. So it's not It's not so much liberty, moral agency, or any sort of an optimistic understanding of human being, but they do take seriously this notion of equality, that we are all equal in the eyes of God. And what that means is that all human institutions that elevate some people over other people are theologically suspect. And that then means that slavery as an institution is theologically suspect. So I think, for pushing that equality button and pushing it hard and doing something about it, the Quakers do get great credit, right, as a religious movement that helped to achieve something important in the modern world. Now, whether you then, if you want to then take credit for that, now I say we're 20th and 21st century Christian people, then I think what we have to do is to say, the 0.01% of the population that were Quakers, we think they got Christianity right, but all of the other tradition is wrong. And that's a very big theological church history statement for one to have to make.
This is an exciting conversation for me, partly because I think as someone who's found a lot of meaning and actual intellectual excitement in sort of returning to my Catholic tradition in just
it's
recent
a very
years.
rich tradition, absolutely.
Yeah, the thing that I am struck by, and what to some extent is clanging with me, although you're though I don't know that I have a great rebuttal, is this. I think there's we have this thing that I have not personally grappled with very much. Or I don't have like some theory of it exactly. But you kind of touched on it there. So you got this tiny minority of sort of let's call it thought leadership. Maybe that's not the perfect way to describe what they were doing, but let's call the Quakers and the Salons in France and the William Wilberforce in Britain. I think there is a sense in which people have to go along. The broader society has to ultimately adopt that sort of thought leadership and be comfortable with it ultimately to see this happen. If all you have is an elite that holds this egalitarian view and everyone else opposes it, how do you get it to happen? So like, is there and again, this is much more, whether or not one is religious or not, I think shouldn't rely, frankly, on making these kinds of arguments on historical grounds necessarily. But is it not, do you not think it's a valid thing to note that these were still fundamentally there was a broader receptivity to that moral message because of the shared theology at the time, even though it's fractious. Like in America, we're like this crazy fractious bunch of misfits who all came here to escape the Anglican and Catholic oppression, let's say, in the early days, right? But it's still like a overwhelmingly majority Christian country in all three cases. And we don't see an equivalent successful thought leadership in, let's say, the Islamic world. Like that doesn't happen. So how do you account for that? Because it's a little sterile, and maybe it's correct the way your matrix. Okay, it's just the individualism. The thing that I've come to be skeptical of is in this sort of very narrowly individualistic approach. Not as
how the social coordination happens.
Well, because you do have these other feedback loops, and so you have an emergent kind of the way I put it these days is, the kind of individualism that we have that's an Enlightenment phenomenon is a boat that was designed well to float in an ocean that had a kind of Christian culture, and maybe that's wrong. But
I think
the two other places I look in our history that didn't have Enlightenment values emerge the way we have in whether it's in the communist world or the Islamic world, it's maybe that's correlation and not causation. I mean, I think that's what you believe, but it's where I find it like, I mostly agree with you, but there's a part of me that thinks you're being reductionist and putting it into more sterile categories than are appropriate for being like accurate.
No, the history is great, and again, I do think it's going to be that the Judeo-Christian tradition has contributions, the Greco-Roman tradition has contributions. What we are getting into now is the follow-up question of weighting the contributions. But then the weighting of the contributions needs to be broken down because there's a lot of different social dimensions at work. So it's not just the religious culture, it's also the political culture, the economic culture, the romantic culture, the artistic culture, and so on. And each of those historical stories needs to be sorted out. So what the interesting claim then would be to say, if we are saying abolition was a great successful movement, and maybe it's not, particular Christian themes, but it was a broader, softer, gentler, sort of osmotic Christian culture that it was able to take seeds in, even if all of these other, say, Enlightenment values and perspectives were essential for doing it.
Well, in the most low resolution way I could say that would be, and this is not going to be this is going to be uncharitable to Islam. So, but you have one theological tradition whose central character in Jesus Christ is someone who, in all his actions, more or less, is welcoming of misfits and outsiders and sinners and lepers and prostitutes and tax collectors and all these people, and who then submits to crucifixion. Right. So that's that. So whatever emerges in terms of the church and its hierarchies and its etc., you still fundamentally can't escape. Like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The guy that said that, what his way, truth, and life were like, kind of give you a lot to work with there.
Yeah.
That point towards everything we're talking about, I think. Even if you think, well, he's just some guy who cares and the rest of the truth claims are hogwash. In Islam, you have a faith tradition born of a very different character who also spread his religion not in salons under persecution like early Christendom, but by the sword from the outset. So I think that gives rise to a different character. And whatever you think about what comes next, I can't unsee the way those things then you can see that character in the current governance.
No, absolutely.
And then the third category of religions is Marxist communist, which says basically the individual is nothing but a cog in the collective machine, and that your ends unto yourself are irrelevant. It is only the collective ends that matter, and that there is no such thing as the individual, and the perfect utopia will see the complete dissolving of the individual into socialist man. And so, and also that socialist man is possible, and that you can straighten the crooked arrow of man such that you would achieve this utopia. And this is going to take us to some other philosophical threads, but like, I see those three categories and say, well, one is a sort of fallen original sin, but redemption and open-hearted acceptance, tolerance, and a claim and a call to get on board, right? One is spread by the sword, a philosophy of both peace and war. That is universalist, but universalist in very explicitly authoritarian ways, that sees no notion of the secular in the way that, say, Christendom comes to define. And then the other is just communist mass murder factory because the individual doesn't matter.
No, exactly.
Is that too low resolution to be useful philosophically? Am I just doing storytelling to suit my own objectives in your case, in your view?
Not at all. No, I think that's a low resolution flying over the territory at in an airplane at 36,000 feet, and that is a useful perspective to take. So if And I think it's a very modern take. If you take that interpretation of Jesus and you stress those themes and only those themes about what the message of Jesus is, then you do have one thread that can be picked up in the modern world and then working with other threads to create what we then would call Enlightenment culture, and then all of the social and institutional transformations that come out of
it's
it.
the Sermon
And
on.
I think that's,
You can get it straight out of the Sermon on the Mount. It's like
yeah, for sure.
yeah,
That's right. Yeah. Okay. No, I think that's exactly the kind of fine-grained argument that one would have to make. And then you do get into all of the theological interpretations, so I'm stressing these 4 things about Jesus. I'm not stressing these other 12 things about Jesus. Is that a legitimate move to make? And then saying that these are the 4 themes that were historically impactful in the 1200s or in the 1800s. And so we have to make the good historical. And I'm open to all of that. And I do think that there is an important set of differences, that Christianity is going to provide slightly more fertile soil for all of these cultural developments than either Islam, for sure. And I think the other big contender historically would have to be Judaism, where Judaism is less individualistic, but it is more cognitively individual, morally more collectivistic. We are chosen people, groups, right, stay together, but it is more cognitively individualistic than the Christian tradition because it emphasizes more debate and reading right from the get-go and so on. So,
I mean, I think
so we would need to do all of that.
And I wasn't calling out Judaism partly because just in terms of size of populations, it's not big enough. I mean, they have an outsized impact on the world in ways that are amazing and also give rise to all kinds
because of there is a strong dose of cognitive individualism in there that's encouraged.
0.02% of the population produces like 25% of the Nobel Prize winners. You got to take notice.
It's amazing on for sure. And so then we would have the same question, because that's a huge accomplishment. So if we go back and read Hebrew scriptures, we're going to have a long theological discussion about whether modern Judaism, producing all of these outside results, can be traced back to these passages in Hebrew scriptures and then at various historical junctures. If we can indulge the history a little more, though, what I want to say is maybe the 1200s, the 1300s are going to be a more decisive couple of centuries for the story that we want to tell about how we became in the modern world. So at that point, we have Western Europe is kind of opening up again. It's coming to life again. Partly, I think that was because the millenarian expectation that when the year 1000 struck, for numerological reasons.
Millenarian as in the millennium.
Yeah.
The doomsday of the millennium, right?
It's going to be the end of the world, and Jesus will return. There will be the apocalypse, et cetera, et cetera. And so, since history is about to end, we really don't need to pay much attention to secular matters, worldly matters, and so on. But
it's funny to think that 1,000 years after that, our only concern is what will happen to the clocks in our computers.
Yeah, the Y2K fear. Yes.
How times have changed.
Yes, that's a fascinating story to tell. But then when the year 1000 comes and goes, and then people, well, I guess we don't know when. Just to put it blunt, we don't know when the apocalypse is going to happen, so we might as well get on with business. And so we start to pay more attention to worldly types of concerns. So trade picks up, and then there's intercourse with the Arabic world and the Persian worlds right beyond that. Mm-hmm. Rediscovery of some manuscripts. There's pushback against the Muslims, and in southern Spain, a rediscovery of lots of manuscripts. The Medici and the Cosmo in the 1300s is importing lots of artworks and manuscripts that had been lost in various other sources as well. So what we have then is people are starting to be interested in actually making a living, and so they become more worldly, more practical concerns, and suddenly they're confronted with a an awareness of just how magnificent Greek and Roman culture had been. And this was a huge shock to most people. So this is then becoming the generation of Albert the Great, and then as the 1200s go on, Thomas Aquinas, who's then the next big giant in this story. So we're back in the 1200s, shading on into the 1300s.
Is Thomas Aquinas properly understood as being Aristotelian in his in the way
Yes,
he
I think absolutely.
Yeah.
The most famous portrait you will see of Aquinas is him standing there, and in one hand he's holding scripture, in the other hand he's holding a Greco-Roman building in a structure. And so the explicit point is, I, as Thomas Aquinas, see as my project a way of saying there's enormous value in the Greco-Roman tradition, there's enormous value in the Judeo-Christian tradition. They are not antagonistic as they have been interpreted for almost 1,000 years. Rather, they can and should be integrated. He is one of my intellectual heroes, and I think he's of decisive importance for world history, right? For precisely this integration. So what we then have, though, I think, is over the course of the subsequent sectors is ongoing, at least in the West, influence of Judeo-Christian philosophy and Judeo-Christian moral culture, but then also absolute importance of the Greeks and the Romans. And it's not just the political culture, as we were mentioning in the New World and its political architecture. It becomes the transformation in the arts. So by the time we get to the generations of Leonardo and Michelangelo, to take Michelangelo as the clear example, it's a hybrid art. So the David, for example, it's a biblical story, but it's a biblical story told as a celebration of human physical beauty that's totally a Greek and Roman nude model. So all of the Christian attitudes about the shamefulness of the body and covering up the body have gone away. And we still have then some Judeo-Christian element. The moral story is important there, but it's now cast in a Judeo-Christian cultural form. We start to have an introduction, a transformation of the architecture and the engineering. Again, learning explicitly from the Romans. So we're learning from the Greeks and the Romans artistically, scientifically, engineering, the politics, and all of those bring an ethics with it. It's one thing to think the human body is disgusting and should always be hidden, versus which is the human body is potentially beautiful and noble, and we can aspire to excellence. To say that we should not be building beautiful cathedrals. It's hard for us to imagine, but this was controversial in the 1200s because they are the lust of the eyes.
Oh, sure.
Right? And
I mean, pride is considered the sort of the cardinal of the cardinal sins.
That's right. To pride then also then be something that I should aspire to. I am a worthy person. I'm a potentially worthy person, and anybody. This is the ideal of the Renaissance man and increasingly the Renaissance woman. Anybody can become pretty special, and should strive to become special by one's own effort and instead of seeing oneself as crushed under a burden of sin. So that's a moral revolution, and we have both of those operative in the modern world and increasingly. So then it's Roman engineering integrated with church architecture, and so the idea is that we can better celebrate God by learning from the pagans about the way the natural world actually works.
And I would say it's an underappreciated aspect. Again, to be my pro-papist self here, that I do think that there is a underplayed element of church history in this time and moving forward of seeing science and discovery as being good and being a discovery of God's creation, that it was not.
That's right.
We get this very stylized, the church just threw Galileo in house arrest and it doesn't. It's not that it's false. It's not like that didn't happen, but there's a nuance there that I think gets lost. That is not just soft apologetics. I think there's a very real sense in which the monasteries are the university in Bologna being the first university, the sense in which the like European world of universities and study were monastic and in nature, I think is all true. I mean, would you agree with that sense?
Okay. Well, all of that church history that you're talking about being more science friendly, all of that comes from Aquinas. Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
The lust of the eyes, the pride of the scientists being dismissive, that's all Augustine. So to the extent that then the Catholic Church divided among Augustinians and Thomists, and they are still divided, and you still find both of those attitudes. It's the Thomistic tradition that prevailed. And it's on this count that Galileo, whom you mentioned, but he's almost 4 centuries later, 3.5 centuries later, he is the one who is the good Thomist in this case, because he is arguing, right, that God in effect wrote 2 books. He wrote Scripture, and he wrote the book of nature. And the theologians study the book of Scripture. The scientists study the book of nature. They come from the same author, same message in 2 different forms. So the dominant institutionalized church that is still persecuting and censoring, that's incorrect Catholicism from Galileo as a good Catholic's perspective. So yes, so the development of modern science, partly it does come from Aquinas rehabilitating the Greeks and Romans and trying to integrate it with Christianity. Now, then if you step back and you say, well, by the time we get to Galileo, if we're going to be science friendly, if we're going to be engineering friendly, is this something that is an internal development to Christianity? Or is it something that comes out of the Greek and Roman tradition that has been grafted on to Christianity and maybe forming an uneasy compromise? Again, I think all of that still needs to be worked out.
Yeah.
So
we have this tension. If I to sort of summarize our journey together so far, we have this tension between authority, religion, faith, and the individual, and the pursuit of truth in the material world, science, inquiry, the inquisitor versus the inquisitive, perhaps.
Nice.
And you have this thing that we come to understand as sort of the Western civilizational culture, whatever that means. I have spent the past couple months sort of revisiting it to the best of my ability with my limited time some of the things that sort of we take for granted now in our language, starting with the notion of left and right and its origin in the moment of the French Revolution, because that's where, to the best of my understanding, that when we say left and right today, it is like a callback to the assembly at the time of the early, the French Revolution, and who was in favor of more or less moderate reform and still keeping the monarchy and the aristocratic structures. That was the right, that they sat to the right. And to the left were the Jacobin types, the radical revolutionaries.
And a whole lot of classical liberals and moderates.
Yeah, so so one of the ironic, interesting, strange things about the current use of the term left and right is that the American constitutional Declaration of Independence tradition, I think, could be understood at that moment as being on the left, in the same way that, and so you have Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine being very excited about the French Revolution. And then you have this ecstatic and then ultimately literally nightmarish reign of terror under Robespierre in France, and the conversion of Notre Dame into the Temple of Reason, etc. But you talk about this moment in the development of today's postmodernism. starting with Rousseau. And as I understand it, that Rousseau is like the spirit of the French Revolution in a lot of ways. So let's like take me from Rousseau to the present. To the present university, there is no truth. Pick your gender stuff that our kids get soaked in. Because
nice.
because I think that like we could talk for hours. I love it so much, but I want to make sure we lay this out, because that antecedent history we've been talking about, I feel like brings us to this moment of this clash in its most extreme form. And then the way that carries through to today, I find to be really important and fascinating.
Oh, yeah, absolutely right. So you mentioned contemporary universities, and earlier you had mentioned medieval universities and their formation. So I think probably you're right. We should drop the discussion of the medieval universities. Absolutely fascinating and important part of the story. And jump 4 or 5 centuries to the height of the Enlightenment, Rousseau, French Revolution, and our scandalous political vocabulary, the way left and right are used so promiscuously and bizarrely in many cases. So, yes, as much as possible, I try to avoid using left and right, partly because those are used in the journalism, in our political journalism, so variably. And one doesn't simply want to get into long discussions about how I'm using right, who counts and who doesn't, and history right, and so on. So I do think they are mostly sloppy labels, but I do find myself using them sometimes in historical context. So if it's very clear, for example, that you are in early 1800s Germany, talking about the political landscape there, left and right, is by and large picking out groups, and everybody knows who's included and who's not included. And there is, as you suggest, is tracing it back to the early days of the French Revolution, the seating chart issue: who's to the left of the speaker and who's to the right of the speaker. Now, I think let's start with the French Revolution story, 1789, maybe 1788, depending on what symbolic dates one wants to choose, on through 1791, 1793, and then 1795, the different phases, and then backtrack to the question of Rousseau, who was writing his works mostly in the late 1740s on through the 1750s and 1760s, who had died by the time the French Revolution came around. So yes, by the time we get to 1789, or the political landscape is that French feudalism is failing. All of the long series of Louis, 13, 14, 15, and on into 16. The monarchy had been extraordinarily powerful and had succeeded in largely emasculating the aristocracy. But because of not keeping up with what's going on in the rest of the world and internal problems, the peasantry and the emerging middle classes are poor, desperate, struggling in various ways. There's lots of political problems, lots of economic problems. And there is also the phenomenon of the French Enlightenment, where thinkers like Diderot and Voltaire, you mentioned earlier, Montesquieu and others, largely inspired by British philosophy. So Voltaire spent some time in exile in England, enormously impressed with Newton, with John Locke, with the Quakers. It's fascinating when he wrote his series of reflections, like the first 5 letters he writes are about the Quakers. And he has this very positive portrayal of this Quaker character. So you have this very pro-science, rights of man, equality, liberty, religious toleration movement that has sprung up.
Yeah, Gordon Wood said that the way Gordon Wood put it was that Britain was the most radically freedom-oriented place in Europe, and America was the radicals of the radicals in favor of individual liberty and freedom. I mean, slavery notwithstanding, but
yes, that's right. And then Voltaire largely imported and popularized that British philosophy for the French. And again, Montesquieu, Diderot, and the others are part, and that hugely ambitious project of the the encyclopedia. Yeah, they were going to capture all of the knowledge of human beings, articles written by experts, but to be read by everybody. And it's not just theoretical knowledge, it's how do you make a power loom? How do you make an anvil for a ship? All of this technological knowledge and so on. So mass education and so on. So this Enlightenment philosophy was strong. At the same time, the monarchy is has been very powerful, but it's in a weak moment with Louis XVI, who is kind of a nice guy, but he's inherited a lot of problems. And even to some extent, he's somewhat inspired by Enlightenment ideals and thinks that some reform is possible. And the aristocrats, who had been emasculated for the last century and a half, saw a moment that they could force.
What does that mean, just real quick? What does it mean that the aristocrats were emasculated?
Okay. Well, if you think in the feudal system, you divide everybody into classes. So the royal family is at the top, and they have a certain amount of power. But the aristocrats have a lot of power over their domains. And then you have the guilds and some freeholders of property, and then serfs and peasants and slaves and so on. So you have this very hierarchical. Most of feudal history politically is a matter of jockeying for power between the aristocrats and the royal family. So the aristocrats typically are the ones who want to have a weaker monarchy so they can share the power more among themselves. So often they are more egalitarian and decentralizing. Right? But what had happened, though, under the succession of Louis, was that the monarch succeeded in centralizing significant amount of the power unto himself. The sun god and so on. And by emasculating the aristocrats, as to say, it made them less manly, or to cut their testicles off, to put it bluntly. So it succeeded in taking away many of the feudal privileges and powers that the aristocrats had and devolving them to the central government under the king. So the aristocrats, for example, one of the tools that was used was that they were ordered to spend a certain amount of time in Paris and Versailles each year. And that meant that they were away from their traditional power base wherever they were. That they had to be in attendant on the king. And of course, when they are there, they're away from their power base. They're not able to manage their affairs. They start having sexual affairs and trying to suck up to the king and so on. So they become not really aristocrats. They just become pretty adornments by and large. Now, this is overstating the case, but
Okay.
The aristocrats, there's many of them, and they want to get some power back. So they're the ones who, if we're going to have an argument about when the French Revolution started, they were the ones who forced the king to call the Estates General. That's the assembly of the three estates, the aristocrats, the clergy, and then the third estate, the other people. The clergy is the first estate, aristocrats are the second estate, and so on.
And then all the rest of the rabble are the third estate.
Yes, that's right. And this had not happened for, I'm not quite sure, almost 2 centuries. So the fact that they were able to force the king to call this assembly and that the king was going to listen to them, that was a significant moment. Now, what's then I think important is that in each of these constituencies, most of the clergy are representing the established church, and so they're very traditionalist and hierarchical. But you do have a significant number of the clergy who are not particularly religious. They were the third son, and the family just said, let's put one of the kids in the church so that we have a power base inside the church. Or they are having doubts about their faith, and they're actually kind of deistic. And some of them are inspired actually by French Enlightenment ideals and willing to reform. The same thing is true among the aristocrats. You have a lot of aristocrats who are not particularly enamored of, maybe they have daddy issues, and a lot of them did have daddy issues, right? Or they were the second son, and so they knew that they weren't going to get the title, or they were inspired by French Enlightenment ideals as well. And then among the third estate, you did have a lot of people who were rabble, as you say. This is a cheap joke, but most of them were provincial lawyers, and so bring all of your worst lawyer jokes right? So a lot of the third estate are people from that category of society.
And
But then some of them,
can I pause us for just a
yeah,
minute to
go ahead.
just what I'm struck by, and I've had some conversations recently on the show to this effect, that this aristocratic class you're talking about strikes me as sounding a lot like the voting base for Sirhan Mamdani. This sort of this like managerial class of our society in America who went to all the right schools, the dirty dozen of Ivy Leagues and adjacent, who have sort of believed that it is their time to take over the reins of being the new elite, and are finding themselves unable to afford an apartment in New York City, and therefore donning the mantle of the working man to call for a new socialism.
Sure. Oh yeah.
It
Yeah.
sounds very similar. It sounds like you've
Okay.
got like if we have like an emasculated late Gen Z, or like young millennial, old Gen Z managerial elite, it seems like that's an exact analogy almost.
Okay. All right.
Uh,
Well, I'm not up on New York demographics, but I take the hypothesis, and that's a good research project, I think, for someone. But yeah,
It
that's a
is my
story that's
fear.
been
It's my fear that actually
it's been
2020,
told in many
yeah,
forms. Yeah.
2025 America. My greatest fear is that 2025 America rhymes a little too much with late 1780s France. But
Yeah, possibly. That's right. And in ancient Egypt, I think there are parallel stories as Rome became an imperium. Julius Caesar, for example, was a great populist and had attracted a lot of those types as well. So you have this mix of formerly three estates, and they're called. Now, very quickly, though, what I want to say is that it is the classically liberal ones who dominate for the first couple of years. And so Thomas Jefferson, when he's very excited about what's going on in this French Revolution, I think he was right in that historical moment to be excited. So very quickly spun away from the aristocrats as a class, being able to control events, to this more open movement where the estates started to mix more. Still people sitting here on the left, sitting here on the right, but the center of energy and the center of ideas were more Enlightenment liberal types of people. And the most important thing to note here is that the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen, that is first published and signed off on, that was primarily authored by Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette. And this is an interesting guy. He's a Marquis, right? So he is a member of the aristocracy, right, so to speak. But he is classical liberal to his bones, and he's one of the ones who had good training and went across the Atlantic to work with the American revolutions to fight against the British and so on. And he's inspired exactly by those ideals. If you read the Declaration, the French Declaration, it is very congruous with the principles of the American Declaration of Independence. So all of that, right, is going on. So we move it from an aristocratic phase to a classically liberal phase. What I think then happens tragically is 2 or 3 years into the French Revolution, the aristocrats as a class are now a weak force. The clergy is scattered and on the defensive. The classical liberals, I think my reading is just that they were complacent. They thought it was all one, it was in the bag. But you did have a smaller minority group on the left side sitting there. These are the ones who are the Girondins, the Jacobins, as they came to be called, who were much more radically, not liberal, but radically egalitarian, proto-socialist and proto-authoritarian socialist. And it's they who are the ones who became more energetic, and they basically captured the movement 2 or 3 years into the movement. And so, yes, Robespierre, Danton, Saint-Just, and the others, they ascend to power. The classical liberals then are a weakened force. So it's largely a matter of political maneuvering and political energy and partly political accident that they were able to come to power. And then the reign of terror becomes the logical outcome because of those ideas. They're not individualistic at all, unlike the other classical liberals. They don't believe in property rights, unlike the Declaration. They don't believe in tolerance religiously, so to speak. Instead, they have a strongly authoritarian, what we would now call socialist egalitarian, with a small group of people at the top, directing society with the idea of totally remaking society in a certain image. And at that point, then we're into the reign of terror. So I have that 3 or 4 stage analysis of the French Revolution. Now, why Rousseau matters is that all of the top 3 to 5 people of the Jacobins, the leaders of the Reign of Terror, so Robespierre, Saint-Just, Danton, Marat, and the others, all of them are explicitly, proudly followers of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his philosophy. So, to the point where the way many Christians will carry around copies of the Bible and read it in reflective moments. He carried around a copy of Rousseau's political treatise, the Social Contract, and he would read it, and he saw himself as a disciple putting it into practice. And Rousseau is as anti-Enlightenment as you can possibly get. Hates individualism, hates reason, hates the idea of religious tolerance, hates the idea of a free press, wants to close down all of the printing presses and bring them under government control, wants to shut all of the theaters down, wants to get rid of the scientists who are pursuing science in the wrong direction, wants to get rid of all of the technologies that are being celebrated in the Industrial Revolution and take human beings back to a much more agrarian, back to nature, back to the land, tribal understanding of a socialist community, but of course with a certain number of authoritarian leaders who represent the general will under his control. He was also a strong opponent of the separation of church and state that had been part of the earlier French Revolution, the classical liberals, Lafayette and other. He argued explicitly that human beings need religion, and what we need to do is just modernize traditional religion, get rid of the spooky supernatural stuff, but nonetheless keep the core of traditional Western religion, marry it once again with the state in a modern understanding of what the state should be, and that is going to be the way forward. So what you then have is, in the French Revolution, really, you have the old conservatives, the representatives of the clergy and the aristocrats. You do have the modern classical liberals who are very pro-Enlightenment, pro-individualism, pro-science and technology, and this emerging Rousseau-inspired movement that is the opposite and opposed to both of those. So the big 3-way debate that we are now still largely in the midst of, by the time we start talking about contemporary culture and what's going on in contemporary universities, all of them are still there.
Yeah, you see in this, so there's this in revisiting Rousseau, you hear very strong echoes of a lot of modern movements. The celebration of indigenous peoples. And I'm putting that in strong scare quotes because it's kind of a ridiculous idea. Who is indigenous? When does the clock get started, and by whom?
Yeah.
Given
So
all, but
yes.
he's got this idea, right? This idea that there's this sort of noble savage life that lived in a kind of Garden of Eden, but for real, not like a theological Garden of Eden, like an actual, Pocahontas, Avatar. We got it. The Avatar movie's coming out. The third one, Avatar, is Rousseauean in its storytelling.
Yes, and Dances with Wolves as part of its sub-theme, if we go back a generation. Yes, Rousseau is doing some speculative anthropology, right? So, but this idea that is still popular with us, of going right back to nature. I'm just saying that's an anachronistic term. Indigenous is also anachronistic, right, for this time. But that human beings went from a mostly isolated, very savage time period where nature provided all of their basic needs, and the man and the woman just got together to copulate and produce the next generation, but they weren't particularly affectionate or even forming family movements. He doesn't want to go back to that, but he does think that what we would probably call the tribal era of human history, where human beings are organized in not even clan is too big, but maybe groups of 100 or 200, extended family networks, several of those, living close to the land, everybody knowing everybody, that's the best that human beings can be and the best that human beings ever will be. And that all of the so-called, from his angle, civilization and progress since then has been a big mistake and made us work. So in that sense, what he wants to do is have a modernized tribalism. You know, we can't go back to the Garden of Eden, and that probably wasn't the best for human beings. But yes, we are corrupt. There's nothing wrong with humans per se, but all of the institutions that we have developed, particularly the Enlightenment institutions, are corruptions, and we need to go back to a simpler social time and a simpler back to nature time.
One of the other things that I see in him that survives today is the sense in which there's a kind of blank slateism, that the human is not inherently flawed or fallen, but is perfectible, and that we are the victims of our circumstance. Like, if we were to be born into this sort of 200-person agrarian clan, we would be great. It wouldn't be like, say, every commune ever constructed that fails because people free ride and steal. No, we would be wonderful, lovely people. And the only reason why we're not wonderful and lovely is because of essentially like what Marx would call our economic conditions, that we are the product of our economic conditions. Do you think that's a fair reading of the way he's coming at his notion of the nature of man?
Yeah, blank slate is a complicated term because it can mean, as you're pushing, I think appropriately is pushing, is what is our moral status at birth, and what is our moral development natural trajectory. That's one kind of blank slate. You can say, people are born evil, or people are born good, or they're born neutral. There's also cognitive blank slate issues. Are we born with knowledge, with innate ideas? Are we born with a conscience, or are we born without any ideas and everything we learn through our experience? If we take the moral issue, we might say that human beings are born morally neutral, but there still then is going to be the additional question of moral agency. And here, John Locke, for example, does believe that we are born morally neutral, but individuals have internal agency, and the environment is important, influence on them. But the more important thing is how you choose to use your moral agency, including the influences from the environment, to develop yourself. Rousseau believes that human beings are born more morally neutral, but he doesn't believe in internal moral agency. So the second part of what you're saying becomes important here. Instead, we are born into a collective, into a community, into environmental circumstances, and we are molded and shaped by those. So born into bad circumstances, we will become bad. Born into good circumstances, we will become good. So
what's wrong with that? Isn't that true? Like, if I'm born into a family of mobsters and I'm raised in the ethos of organized crime, I will be normalized into the idea that that's the way the world works, and I'm gonna play that moral game. And if I'm born into a different one, I mean, isn't there a truth in that observation?
Well, now what we have is then the issue of moral blank slate, or born weighted to the evil, or born weighted to the good. And now the question is, that cuts across that, is whether I'm born weighted to the good, neutral, or how much agency do I have? And so do I then say I could say I'm totally determined by my biology. So I would have a biological determinism, no agency, but also environment doesn't have to do with it. I could believe I'm totally determined by God because God is omnipotent in everything that happens, including me. I'm just a puppet in the hands of God. So again, I don't have any moral agency. I could believe that I am totally a product of the environment. That's the hypothesis you were just floating a moment ago. Or I could say it's a mixture of all of those things. I have agency, but then the other things are influential and so on. So all of the debates over free will and determinism are what we have to enter into here. Now, I think any sort of environmental determinism runs into obvious problems. You're born into a mobster family, but there's always kids who reject the ethos of the mobster family.
There's all the twin studies that show that there's
and
a
the twin studies, that's
strong
right.
genetic predispositions to things.
Yeah, and male versus female crime patterns and all of these sorts of things. I was just calling to mind the trilogy The Godfather of a generation ago.
Yep.
So Michael Corleone, played by Al Pacino, he is born into a mob family and he's acculturated to that, and his brothers do go along with it, but at least when he was young in the first episode, he's rejecting it and he's exercising agency to reject it. And part of the tragedy, of course, is that he gets sucked in.
Yeah.
But the Coppola, the director and the scriptwriter, is making clear that he's not a product of his family's ethic. He's making a choice to turn his back on a certain kind of way of life. Now, that's a philosophical claim that's embedded in the movie. So, the way those two cut across from each other, though, is that you can believe that people are born with original sin, but then you can still believe that people have some agencies to fight against the sin.
Yeah.
Or you can believe that people are born into sin and they have no agency; they are totally slaves to sin. You can believe that people are born into environments and that they are largely conditioned by their environments and they have zero agency. Or you can believe that they have some agency even in a dominating environmental agency. So that's just an ongoing debate about sorting out how much power I have at moral agency versus the other causal forces acting upon me.
So this Rousseau, this sort of romance of Rousseau, this sense of picking out a time that is the idyllic type of person, type of moment, type of organizational structure, and not how does that work its way through to modern day?
Yeah.
How do we end up? Does that inform the Bolsheviks? How does it find its way to a world where our kids go to a modern liberal arts college and it is taken for granted by and large across the majority of the faculty that there's no such thing as objective truth, that there's some special personal form of knowing that is linked to your identity, whether it's because you're a person of color or because you're indigenous or whatever. So long as you're not me and you, as long as you're not like a heterosexual white male, you've got some kind of personal knowing that's embodied in your essence, and all the other stuff, that all the other trappings that we've kind of had to suffer through. How do we get from Rousseau to today?
Yeah, what you're describing is a package of beliefs, and I think some of them are attributable to Rousseau. Some of them, I think, come from other sources in the history. So this is again flying over the territory from very high, but I think it is fair to say that when we get into the 1700s, clearly feudalism is on its way out. The monarchies and the aristocracies are being weakened and toppled all over. Then the question is, what are we going to replace feudalism with? And there are two modern answers to that. Of course, there's the conservatives who, by and large, want to say, no, we need to go back to the good old days in various respects. But there's one modern story that is liberal, individualist, capitalist, market-friendly, decentralized, and all of that. Right? And that tradition continues, and it's still with us. And I think probably you and I are in various ways members of that tradition.
Yeah, I would.
So
You could call that, in a certain sense, this isn't exactly fair. It's a kind of root Americanism.
Yes, that was the dominant philosophy, I think, of the 1700s in America, right? And accelerating 1800s and on into the 1900s. The other answer, though, is we're going to replace feudalism not with capitalism and individualism and money making and technology that dehumanizes us.
Voluntary contract, voluntary agreement, none of that stuff.
Right. That's right. No, we are going to replace it with an updated communalism that is much more egalitarian, much more back to our roots in nature and so forth. And out of that, there are lots of sub-schools. You mentioned some of those earlier. And I think that was the dominant form of left thinking up until Karl Marx. So basically from the late 1700s up until the middle part of the 1800s, right? It's this, what we might call a more romanticized, agrarian, communal, back to nature type of socialism that's dominating. Marxism, though, is a kind of hybrid because it wants to say that technology is a good thing. And actually, capitalism has been a good thing in the sense that it has broken feudalism down, made it a possibility. It's clarified the exploitative relationships between human beings. It has organized the workers into an urban proletariat. And it has developed all of the tools of production to a high level and created all of the wealth. So all of that is progressive from the Marxist perspective because it's taking us to what's going to be the next stage, which will be the dictatorship of the proletariat and then the creation of the new communist man. But what's interesting about that philosophically is that Marxism is friendly to technology, and the Rousseauians are hostile to technology. The Rousseauians are more likely to say we need an act of will, not an act of logic and rational social planning, an act of will to get ourselves in sympathy with each other, and we're going to form an empathetic communal bond. That's the right way for humans to organize themselves. The Marxists don't talk that language at all. They talk about there is the leadership, right, in the movement who know the laws of science, the mechanical iron laws of social science, and they can make their predictions and they can lead everybody according to the right strategy into the proper future. So that's a very different socialism with communism as the output from the kind of socialism that the Rousseauians are advocating. Now, long story short, though, it's the Marxist version that comes to dominate by the early part of the 20th century. Not I think for intellectual reasons per se, but just because Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, and the others were committed Marxists. They actually succeeded in mounting a revolution and trying to put Marxist ideas into practice. As a result of that success, all of the socialists around the world, and there would be a dozen or more major flavors of socialism, including new Rousseauian kinds of socialism, but all of those basically gave up the ghost. I'm overstating a little bit. Went into the background. Everybody piled onto the Marxist train and said, this is the wave of the future. And so for the first half of the 20th century until well after World War II, after the death of Stalin, it is the Marxist version of socialism that dominates.
And just to add on to that, I know a friend of mine from my old econ super nerd days, Phil Magnus, has written about this history and about the fact that just as a matter of publishing citations, Marx is like a marginal figure until the Soviet Union. Like this, the treatment today of Marx, I think the Communist Manifesto might be among the most read books in undergraduate,
or at least most assigned.
Or most assigned, I think it is. It's like one of the most assigned books for undergraduates, which is a sign that our academy is corrupt. that is a product of the Soviet Union. That is a product of active promotion, pushing of Marx above all these other thinkers.
Yes, no, I think that's right, and that is Phil Magnus's work is looking at the Google engrams are in all of the counts, and I think that is borne out quite nicely from a worldwide perspective. If we narrow our focus to what's going on inside, broadly speaking, the socialist movement, Marxism in the 1800s increasingly becomes a more significant one relative to the other ones. But yes, it does burst out as a worldwide unifying force only after 1917. But I think the important thing, and where Rousseau becomes important again, is that when we get to the 1950s, that is the decisive decade for the transformation of socialism once again, because by then it's clear that the socialist experiment in the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent the other big one that's happening in China, are not going well. It's clear that while socialism had pitched itself as humane and caring about people, that it was brutal and nasty and all kinds of repressions and gulags. All of that was not just CIA propaganda, but we're aware of these as issues, particularly after the death of Stalin.
Mm-hmm.
And then Khrushchev, partly to consolidate his power, wants to clear out the old Stalinists, but he basically makes it known that Stalin and the gulags and all of the political persecutions had gone. And this is a great blow to socialism and that generation of socialists who think that socialism is the only thing that has a moral candle to offer, that capitalism is terrible, exploitation and evil and wicked and so forth. When it looks like, if you look at what's going on in the United States, sure, lots of problems, but what's going on in the Soviet Union is, orders of magnitudes much more horrible. And then the idea of that socialism is going to be a more rational, efficient form of organizing an economy, compared to the messiness and anarchy of capitalism and all of that individualism. So that eventually the Soviet Union is going to just outstrip the West, and all of that. Also, by the 1950s, it's very hard to, unless you're a true believer, to sustain that story. So
there's one moment there that is really weird, is that Paul Samuelson, not a Marxist but a left of center economist, as you know,
as late as I think 1989.
Yeah, his famous textbook on economics, I forget when it is first published, but I think it's in the 60s. Has a graph showing the point at which the Soviet economy will eclipse the US economy.
Yes.
And because of the efficiency of central planning relative to messy competition with all these different companies coming and going.
Yeah, so you got some prominent economists, obviously, in the West who are somewhat gullible.
Yeah, so, it's more,
it fits their priors, and they're willing to accept the official Soviet data as it's coming out.
I mean, it's basically like, hey, a society run by experts like me will grow faster than a bunch of like messy merchant types that don't even have a college degree starting companies. And then he proceeds over the subsequent decades to update his book, simply changing the year at which the Soviet Union will eclipse the United States right up until the point of its total collapse.
Yes.
It's like it's the most perfect, tragic example of like politically motivated reasoning being baked into essential texts in academia that I can think of.
Yeah.
And that aren't just wacky gender studies people, but actually like primary textbook economics.
Yeah, that's a sad story, and a kind of an indictment of some segments of the professoriate in the 20th century. So, but yes, so if we then say, I mean, everybody who knows this history then say there's a big transition to the new left in the 1960s, and what that means is that the old left had died by the time we got to the 1950s, but the old left was this Marxist-dominated philosophy, political economy, call to activism, philosophy that had dominated. So there's a crisis that is going on inside the left in the 1950s. And basically, what are we going to do given that Marxism cannot be right? And there's a big splintering that goes on. Of course, a lot of the Marxists then will say, well, we can just tweak Marx in this way, and we'll develop various kinds of neo-Marxism, and that industry carries on for a while. There are others who want to say that Marx, we need to adjust some of the psychology that Marx was to, as we were talking before, environmental determinist. We have to have more autonomy and agency to the psychological side of human beings to be able to resist environmental programming. That it's possible for humans psychologically to develop false consciousness and to will themselves into various things. So there's more psychological versions of socialism that are working in the social sciences. And they're not directly concerned with economic and political matters, but they are trying to say what we need to do to recondition human psychology in a way that is socialist friendly so that we can again get back to the future revolution and so on.
As I understand it, that thread is, I mean, it's so paternalistic. It's basically like
goodness,
the
yes.
reason why all these middle class and emerging middle class workers don't want to revolt in America is because they've basically been brainwashed by Madison Avenue.
Yeah, exactly.
And they have their class consciousness is a false consciousness. They don't have any humanity or agency. The fact that they can like take care of their family and live the kind of life that only kings and queens lived not that long ago, that's all an illusion. They just need to be, shame on them. They need to get a tweed jacket and then they can get on board with the program. And I guess we'll have to, and,
there's a funny metaphor. Yes. Yeah, that's right.
I'm not being charitable, but that is absolutely what they believed. Like,
so there are still, true believer Marxists out there, but there's lots of variations on neo-Marxism. There's this thread where it's a psychological socialism, and it's not economics that's the mother science, but rather psychology or social psychology that becomes the new mother science. There's the splintering of the socialisms into all of the race, gender, ethnicity groups, where
third wave
Marx had said,
feminism and whatnot.
Yes, that's right. So Marx had said that it's economics that's fundamental, and so all human beings, once we get rid of the bourgeoisie and the capitalists, have the same underlying human nature that can be molded according to the same economic interests. All of that goes by the by, and you have a large number of socialists who are wanting to say, no, it's race that's more fundamental than economic interests, or it's sex and gender that are more fundamental than economics, right? Or it's ethnicity that's more fundamental than economics. And certainly those ethnic socialists, they start to sound a lot more like the old-fashioned national socialists and the fascists. So that thread starts to become very blurry as the time goes on.
One note on that,
and to come directly to Rousseau, the idea that what we need the environmental socialists, so rising concern with environmental issues, but one of the big subsets was to say civilization and industrialization, and Marxism is bad on this as well because it favors industrialization and increased productivity. We need to in effect go back to nature, so that it's man versus nature, and we've been exploiting nature, and we need to get rid of contemporary Enlightenment civilization to get back to what sounds like a very Rousseauian description of the ideal circumstances for human beings. So all of those are kicking around from the 1960s, 70s, 80s to now.
The Club of Rome, Paul Ehrlich, degrowth,
exactly, yes.
The population bomb, Rachel Carson, all the way up to Greta Thunberg today.
Yep. Yes, exactly. That thread, very Rousseauian.
This, you have, and you've written and talked about this at great length elsewhere too, but you have this smorgasbord of things that all Like, what unifies them? Because it seems like in many cases it's like there's a sense of transgression of wanting to, that's sort of a shared leftism,
Yes.
like wanting radical change. But the way I tend to look at it is, if a radical leftism, what unifies it is something like a belief in a utopia on earth, that there is some way that we can escape our, our current constraints. Like queer theories, Marxism seems especially oriented this way, that the notion of gender itself is oppression. And so to
Yes.
transgress against biology is liberation. So there's a
Yeah.
sort of liberation utopianism. Although the race hustler types that end up just sounding like Hitler, that just say like, oh, we are determined by our race. It's like, well, how are you not Hitler, Ibram X. Kendi? You're kind of Hitler. Like, aren't you?
Yeah.
Isn't this just Hitler? What are we talking about here?
Yeah.
They don't seem like they're living in the same world, yet they all come together in this kind of unified front. What unifies
Yeah.
all of this anti-individual, anti-Western, anti-market stuff in like this umbrella?
Yeah.
Or is it not as unified as it feels like from the outside?
I think there are two stories that have to be told there that are complementary. One of the big questions we always have to grapple with is, if we start looking at any individual, whether that individual believes what he or she believes because say just he has thought through things, looked at the evidence, and tried to come up with the best rational explanation of the world. So a more philosophical route to whatever he or she believes. Or whether that person believes what they believe for more psychological reasons, that however they have gotten to where they are psychologically with their mix of semi-thought through beliefs, but values and emotions and desires and hopes and fears and so on, along comes a belief system that pushes all of those psychological buttons, some of which are more intellectual and evidence-based. But what the person then does is adopts that belief system for psychological reasons, not philosophical reasons.
So if you're
So I think,
sort of on the big five and you're more neurotic and you're
well,
less open, that you will be more inclined towards a certain set of philosophies that play to your predisposition.
yeah, I'm not going to. I think Big Five is narrower, a narrower psychological thesis than the claim that I'm making right now, because that is focused primarily on personality issues. There also are character issues. There are habit issues. There are explicit cognitive beliefs, right, that one has, and so on. So I'm pitching it at a bigger picture psychological level. So I do think one of the unifying stories is going to be the more intellectual story that we sketched a few minutes ago. This would be a sub-story applying to people who are pretty smart. They are interested in ideas. They are interested in politics. And when they are young, they make a good faith effort to read stuff and to look at data and look at arguments and counter arguments. And at some point say they come to be committed broadly to some sort of socialist outlook on the world. They think it's true, they think it's moral, they think it's evidence-based and so on. They've got arguments right to back all of that. And that what really is going on in their minds is that rational philosophical approach to that set of ideas. And the evidence for that it's primarily intellectual in nature for them, is that when new evidence comes along, they will change their mind, right? They will say, okay, when I was 19, I became a Marxist, right? But then I read this and a history book, and now I became this kind of neo-Marxist, right? And that was when I was 22. And then when I was 28, right? I read something else or some big event, and I had to change my minds again. So they are taking the broad, say, Marxist template, but they are open-minded to rethinking it according to what they think is good history or good economics or whatever it is. Now, how many people are in that group? I don't know. This is where you need to get to know people individually, and we need to do a lot more surveys where people answer the questions honestly. But I think
I'd
the other
venture to guess
route,
it's small,
I think so.
relatively.
That's and there's always in the entire history of socialism, the more intellectual socialists bemoaning how the socialist movement seems to be filled with all kinds of weirdos and cranks who believe all sorts of crazy things, and they're not paying attention to the proper intellectual framing for these issues.
Or they're as
Probably the most famous.
Lenin's useful idiots that we can't tell them the full
Yes,
story.
yeah, for sure, that's right. Or I'm thinking about George Orwell in The Road to Wigan Pier, which is a kind of a classic in this literature. So he's a thoughtful, I think, open-minded, objective guy, and I think he came to his socialism, through more or less on this intellectual roots, and changed his mind on lots of things. But he's mostly disgusted by the state of the socialist movement, and he goes out of his way to say how many weirdos and cranks and so on are going on. So to answer the unification question, what's going on though, because if there is this great plurality and diversity of weirdos and cranks, but nonetheless we're putting them all in the same container, there has to be something that is unifying them and is going on there. Now, my sense is that, let me put it negatively. Suppose you say, in the modern world, we are still largely an Enlightenment culture, by which we mean, we're a very scientific and technological culture. And so if you're going to flourish well in that culture, it helps to know some science and some technology and to be able to do math. We're a culture that requires individuals and encourages individuals to be very individualistic, explore and find yourself as a teenager. What do you want to do in your life? What job is going to most fulfill you and help you achieve your biggest dreams? And if you don't like that, any of the existing jobs, become an entrepreneur. And we're very celebratory of entrepreneurs who do their own thing. And form your own musical tastes and dress how you decide and experiment a lot. So to abstract from all of that, we have a culture that is very scientific, very technological, and those put cognitive demands on people because the science and the technology are progressing and changing rapidly. We have a culture that puts a lot of cognitive demands on people politically. We want you to think about all of these big issues, that list that you started with earlier on, and be informed on transgender issue and climate change and this, that, and the other thing.
We
have
expect
an
you
opinion on
to
this.
we expect you to decide which emojis are going to be in your X handle, and it's very important that you have gotten that potpourri correct.
Yeah, all the way down to those kinds of decisions, and that puts a big cognitive load on people. And to go on social media and have discussions and arguments about all of these things with people all over the world, to decide what your job is going to be, and to start saving for this aspirational life. And we're all very aware of how the rich and super rich people live, and we all are taught that we can achieve all of those things in our own lives, and that you're going to probably have to change jobs 5 or 10 times over the course of your career, dealing with all of that uncertainty and up and down and changing your skill set and so on. So that then is to say that the modern world is putting huge cognitive, emotional, moral demands on people. Now, we can celebrate that, and we can tell the good news story about that. Isn't it wonderful? I love science. I love technology. I love being the architect of my own destiny and being responsible and so on. But what happens when you have a large number of people who are young adults and it is too overwhelming for them? They know they don't have the math skills. they know they don't have the ability to engage in thinking about scientific issues as they are going to bear on public policy. They don't have the science background, they don't have the engineering background, they don't have the math background. But we are telling them you are going to go out into the world that is dominated by science, math, and engineering. And we have given them very high aspirations, but they also know that they don't, say, have what it takes to become a billionaire or even a multi-millionaire. They feel the work world is alienating. It means working for some mick job, some boring job. Maybe they got a second or third rate education. So the work world seems scary to them. And at the same time, they know that there are other people who have had certain advantages in life. They seem to be smarter, or they came from a technological family, or they had an inheritance, and they feel they are behind the curve. And suppose we also then have a group of people who feel not only cognitively overwhelmed by the world, but emotionally overwhelmed by the world. You want me to handle all of this? That's too much, right? I don't feel like I am up to it. I feel nervous. I feel I don't want to leave my mother's home or to get out of the basement. So I am alienated emotionally, underprepared cognitively, and nonetheless I'm being pressured to
Or
go in a direction.
malprepared, or prepared in a way
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
incompatible with the opportunities that present
That's
themselves.
right. That's right. So all of that. So if you have a large number of people, what kind of philosophy are they going to adopt? If we give them our Enlightenment celebrating message, if we give them our free market creative destruction self-congratulatory message, if we tell them everybody can become a billionaire, including you, but they aren't going to believe it,
Or we tell
then
them, look at how great everything is. We have this surplus of calories, and in 1825, life was brutish and short. And now, what are you complaining about? You're holding a coffee cup in your hand that would have fed your family for a week.
yes, that's right. So all of
Highly
that,
highly unpersuasive posture.
that's right. No, that's true. That's right. And so empirically, it doesn't make any sense, but the psychological reality of the people we are talking about, that it just doesn't compute, because we know we can lay that historical data upon them. We can point out all of the entrepreneurial opportunities, and it's just water off a duck's back. It doesn't compute to them. For someone who does not think, say, like an entrepreneur, right? The entrepreneur gets up and has 20 business ideas before he's had breakfast, right? And some people are very comfortable with that and say, okay, yeah, I tried this new business. We went whole hog for 2 years. It's a complete failure. Doesn't matter. We'll have another idea. We'll go at it and try once again. That's an alien psychology to huge numbers of people. That's frightening to a huge number. You want me to come up with the idea of a business? No, what I want is for someone to give me a job. And what that means to them is someone has already done all of the thinking, made all of the decisions, has a kind of recipe. And what I am intellectually and emotionally prepared for is to go into a job where it's secure and I don't have any emotional risk, I don't have any cognitive demands, or I have a comfortable level of cognitive demands upon me. That kind of person, I think, as we're broadly describing here, is not suited for Enlightenment society. That kind of person wants a kind of socialist society, because what does socialist society promise them? It says everybody else is going to look after you. Right? There's going to be, say, wise governors who are going to make all of the big decisions about all of these really complicated things. You don't have to think about them. It takes the cognitive load off them. It takes the emotional insecurities off them, gives them a ready-made place in society with the guarantees. That psychology, I think, is more fundamental and more widespread and is more explanatory of why people will then adopt socialist beliefs than they've read Marx or they've read Rousseau or they're aware of economic history and the differences between North and South Korea and so on. It's not data driven. It's not a philosophical viewpoint. It's a viewpoint that psychologically makes them comfortable.
You're touching on something that has led me to have more eclectic interests than than I used to, in terms of like the kind of there's a kind of philosophical cleanliness to like classical liberal thought. I can reduce it very simply in a certain sense. The individual is sovereign, only individuals choose, only individual minds think. There are these other types of phenomenon in the world where groups get together and you have emergent outcomes, but they're not the same
Yes.
thing as thought. They're not the
Yes.
same thing as choice. And so this
Yes.
is sort of Mises, Hayek, Rand, etc. This isn't it's mostly Enlightenment, but it's a very particular type of individualism that I think
Yes.
that American institutions in terms of the Constitution is predicated around protecting, right? That our protections, our Bill of Rights, is constituted in order to give as much scope in our society as possible for that individual choosing agent, person,
Absolutely.
to team up with others and make agreements. And so what we
Yes.
call property rights are simply contracts. You and I are going to do a deal, or I'm going to buy a piece of land or equipment from you. And the institutions, the law, the courts, and the culture say, hey, that deal's legit. If somebody backs out of it or somebody else tries to come in and take it, the law steps in, the culture shames. That's called theft.
Yes.
And so we have this thing, classical liberal individualism, individual freedom. And then there's all institutions and all kinds of stuff and norms and things and democratic structures and federalism, all this other layers on top. But at the most basic level, it's the most possible scope for me to choose my circumstances and exit them if I don't like them. I can vote with my feet. I don't, oh, Apple's oppressive monopoly. I can just not buy an iPhone and I am not subject to Apple's oppressive monopoly.
Yeah. Yeah. Problem solved for you.
Problem solved. Vote with your feet.
Yeah. So let me just interject to say, right, that is, I think, a very good description of classical liberalism. And as you point out, it goes down to certain fundamentals, but it rests on that philosophical outlook, right? Individuals thinking, choosing, acting, and then socially networking voluntarily and forming contracts that they have rationally agreed to and they are binding. So that entire philosophy is institutionalized by a certain kind of politics. Absolutely. So the question is going to be, what happens though if people don't like that philosophy, either philosophically or psychologically? That's where you're going to have the contradiction.
Well, and this has been the thing that has been, I think, is at least the way I interpret the moment we're in, certainly in the past, I would say maybe since the financial crisis of 2008, but it has become really acute since 2020, or maybe since 2015, let's say. And that is, how do we do not have a perfectly laissez-faire society. We've got giant government. We've got regulations up the wazoo. That gets, every failure of American healthcare gets laid at the feet of an enterprise instead of government. But in general, let's say we still have a fairly free-ish society, especially in the broad sweep of history. And as we sit here, and certainly for the past decade now, we have this problem that's sort of at the center of this channel's thesis and concern, and the dad part of Saves America, is our kids are suffering a clear, measurable in terms of incidents of cutting and suicide. And never mind like misattribution of like, are they anxious? Are they being asked to be anxious? The stuff that you can measure really, that's not just self-identified. Cutting, suicide, those rates are up a lot. That's real weird. So if I'm a classical liberal and I'm like, this is the best way for human organization, it's the most ethical, it's the most efficacious, I have to confront the collapse of like measures of happiness and well-being for the essentially richest, most privileged human generation this world has ever seen. and hand waving it away as a bunch of spoiled Gen Z snots that should get off TikTok, I think is not only, and I'm not saying you're doing that, but I'm just saying that's not an answer. It's also, I think, not a causal answer. It's not nothing. Like FOMO on TikTok and Instagram is a contributor, but I don't think it's enough to explain the mental health collapse we've seen.
No.
So
No,
how do you grapple with that? You were pointing towards this stuff, but this is like where I'd love to kind of come to a conclusion of this round of our conversation.
Bluntly, education system, disaster, not just failure to educate, but active anti-education. So purpose of the education system, and 90+% of all American kids go to government schools. I don't think it's a political problem, although I think the politics is part of it. It is a philosophical problem. What happens to the vast majority of those kids, including a significant number of kids in private schools, is supposed to be developing their cognitive capacities. It's not doing that. It's to develop their emotional resilience and other emotional capacity. It is not doing that. It is to develop a sense of themselves as an individual, and as an individual who has certain social skills and social values. It is not doing either of those things. In most cases, it is doing the opposite of those things. So what it is doing is developing a large number of people who become teenagers who are cognitively underdeveloped or cognitively have adopted beliefs that are unsuited for them living in a modern civilization. They are emotionally unprepared. They do not have a sense of self developed, and they do not have the necessary social skills. So it's a complete failure on all four of those dimensions. What happens psychologically when you confront any situation that you are cognitively unprepared for? You get nervous, you get scared. It's like the classic, I'm a public speaker. You have that dream, I'm going to give a talk to some huge crowd of people and I've lost my notes and I can't remember. Right? That's a cognitive fear, right? Or that I'm going to be laughed at by people instead of people being able to work with me on various things. So all of those psychological senses of alienation, senses of not being prepared for the world, do come out in the form of people just wanting to exit. I want to exit from school. I want to exit from my social life. I want to exit from life because it's too much. I can't handle it. I'm out. So that psychology is widespread, and primarily over the last generation, I would say it's the education establishment that is to blame. There are racial subversions of that. There are sex and gender subversions of that. So for some of it, I do think has dysfunctional politics, but it's broader than that because the same things are happening in private schools where they're relatively politically instituted. Now, the connection, I think, is to philosophy once again, because you mentioned trying to backtrack some dates. We talk about the transition from Enlightenment philosophy and various iterations of the left. One of the big movements that developed in the 60s and 70s was postmodernism, which is explicitly anti-Enlightenment. All of the institutions, all of the principles, all of the ideas, all of the way down by very clever people. That was high theory in the world of philosophy and academics in the 60s, 70s, and on into the 80s. By the time you get to the 1990s, they are recognizing, as social transformationists and social engineers and social revolutionaries do, the best access to the next generation is through education. So they consciously turn to developing applied postmodernism in the education schools. As in the 1990s, it's now another generation, but of people who have been trained in this ideology who are interested in transforming the certification of teachers. What philosophies and ideas do teachers learn? What should the social structures of classrooms be? And then politicizing the classroom and from the politics side rather, and the funding side and the accreditation side as well. So in the 1990s, a proliferation of and transformation of a lot of the education training journals in a clearly postmodern direction. And then you have then a generation, this is the 1990s, of teachers who go out. By the time we get to 2005, 2015, they are now established in their careers. They are educating the next generation. That's, I think, why, I think you mentioned 2015 as one of your dates, where, you know, very clearly suddenly parents are becoming aware that their kids are coming home and you know, talking about stuff that they have never heard of, sounds very suspicious and in many cases outright dangerous and weird. So high theory in the 60s and 70s, transformation of the education schools, 1990s on into early 2000s. The practical effects, it's this generation of kids. And I think that's the underlying cause of the terrible data and trends that you're noticing.
I, this is a thoroughgoing theme and a whipping boy for me personally. You've landed in my favorite place as a causal theory. As we wrap up, I have a last question for you. We could go for another 3 hours with ease, clearly. I encourage everyone to check out your Peterson Academy course, your lectures online. You know, if you thought we went into detail in this conversation, you ain't seen nothing yet from Professor Hicks. I ask this of every guest as we wrap up our conversation. You know, the show is called Dad Saves America because I'm a dad, because I think that as a man, that is a role that I get to play, and that I hope as many young men will get to play as possible. That's transformational, that's powerful, that makes it that brings me joy and satisfaction, and that has an impact in the world. Not just as a dad, if you are one, but just in your efforts, in your work, in your life. How do you think about your role in the American story?
My role in the American story, that's much more grand than I think. I think of myself as a guy who likes to read and write and talk about philosophy and publish philosophy stuff, and parenting also important. Being a best professor I can for my students, and then I have one or two toes stuck in the ocean of public intellectual and public discourse. So enjoying some of those discussions as well. Well, I think probably my fundamental theme through my career has been that philosophy matters. We are smart beings, potentially smart beings. We think about our lives in a big picture way, our past, our present, our future. What are our top values? How can I make my life and the people I care about in the world more generally better? All of those are guided by our big decisions on philosophical questions, including how much agency do I have as an individual to effect all of those things. So I think philosophy, as we go on, as people are more literate, more sources of information, more aware of the issues, philosophy is coming to the fore. I think we are now having more people having more philosophical discussions than at any time in human history, and I think that's progress for us as humans, as messy and as frustrating as that process is. And we've done a lot of good philosophy. We've created a magnificent civilization. We're all, in that cliched way, lucky to be alive at this moment in time. And all of that is due fundamentally to philosophical transformations and how we think and act in the world. At the same time, we're well aware of a lot of disaster trends going on. And a lot of that is from bad philosophy. And so we're increasingly aware of the power of good philosophy, but also of bad philosophy, which I hope leads us to take philosophy more seriously and get more up to speed with it. So to answer your question, I'm Canadian, although now Canadian and American. I think my place is to be a philosopher and hopefully a philosophy educator as well. But at the same time, I do think philosophy at its best is a do-it-yourself enterprise. It doesn't do anyone any good just to adopt a philosophy and believe it because someone told them. So I do like to be the best philosophy educator I can, with the idea of then taking myself out of the picture so that the person carries on their own to do the philosophical thinking and decision making that makes their life the best it can be.
Stephen Hicks, thanks for being on Dad Saves America. I definitely hope to have you back real soon.
All right, a real pleasure. That time went by so fast. Thanks a lot, John.